In the year 1243, along the coast of northern England, a Cistercian monastery maintained traditions older than memory. Among these was the keeping of the ice house, a task that fell to a lay brother named Oswald, 41 years old, whose weathered hands and patient manner suited the work perfectly. Welcome to this gentle hour. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to this coastal monastery, following Oswald through his winter work of gathering and storing ice from the frozen marsh ponds. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. The morning arrived with that particular stillness that comes only in deep winter, when frost has claimed every surface and the world seems wrapped in silence. Oswald stood at the entrance to the ice house, breathing in air so cold it seemed to carry the scent of stone and snow together. The structure sat partially underground, its thick walls built of local limestone, designed by generations of brothers who understood how earth itself could preserve the cold. He had woken before dawn, as was his custom, and moved through the morning prayers with the same steady rhythm he brought to all things. The chapel had been dim, lit only by tallow candles that cast amber light across the worn flagstones. Now, stepping into the pale gray light of early morning, he felt the familiar anticipation that came with this particular work. The gathering of ice from the marsh ponds that lay a short walk beyond the monastery walls. The tools waited where he had left them the evening before. A wooden sledge, its runners smooth from years of use across frozen ground. Hemp rope, coiled carefully and still supple despite the cold. A long-handled hook fashioned by the monastery's blacksmith, its metal dark with age but strong. Oswald ran his weathered hands along the sledge's edge, checking for any splinters that might need attention, finding none. The sky held that uncertain quality of midwinter morning, neither fully light nor quite dark, a pearl-gray expanse that seemed to glow with its own soft radiance. Frost covered everything, the stone walls, the bare branches of the apple trees in the orchard, the thatched roofs of the outbuildings. Each surface sparkled faintly in the growing light, as though dusted with fine salt. Oswald pulled his woolen cloak more closely around his shoulders, feeling its familiar weight and the scratch of its texture against his neck. The cloak was undyed, the natural gray-brown of the sheep whose wool had been spun and woven by hands in the monastery's own workshop. Beneath it, his simple tunic of heavier wool kept the cold at bay, though he had learned long ago that true warmth in winter came not from standing still, but from steady, purposeful movement. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, a habit formed over decades of Cistercian life. And now, as he lifted the rope and settled it across his shoulder, a phrase from the morning office returned to him unbidden. The melody moved through his mind like water finding its course, requiring no effort, simply present. The path to the marsh ponds wound through the monastery's kitchen gardens, dormant now beneath their covering of frost. The raised beds showed only the dried stalks of last season's herbs, rosemary that still held its scent when brushed, thyme reduced to woody stems, the tall remnants of fennel standing like small sentries. Oswald's footsteps crunched softly on the frozen ground, each step breaking through a thin crust of ice that had formed over the earth during the night. Beyond the gardens, the path descended gently toward the marshlands, where the abbey's flocks grazed in warmer months. Now the land lay empty and still, the grasses bleached pale by winter, bending stiffly under their coating of frost. In the distance, he could see the dark shapes of the ponds, their surfaces transformed into mirrors of dull silver. The air here carried a different quality, damper, with the faint mineral scent of the marsh itself mixing with the clean smell of ice. Oswald breathed deeply, his breath visible as pale clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. His knees, which sometimes ached in cold weather, felt sound this morning, and he moved with the easy gait of a man long accustomed to walking across uneven ground. The first pond came into view as he rounded a low rise crowned with bare willow trees. The ice lay thick across its surface, perhaps 4 inches deep, maybe more. He had checked it 3 days prior, making a small test hole near the edge to measure the thickness, and the cold nights since had only added to it. This was the right time, thick enough to be useful, but not so deep that cutting would become difficult. Oswald set down his tools at the pond's edge and stood for a moment, simply observing. The ice held a blue-gray tint in the morning light, its surface marked with delicate patterns where frost had formed in the night. Small bubbles were suspended within it, frozen in place, evidence of the pond's transformation from liquid to solid. Near the far edge, where reeds grew thick in summer, their dried stalks now poked through the ice at angles, creating shadows that stretched across the frozen surface. He knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the cold ground, and touched the ice with his bare hand. The chill bit sharply against his palm, but he kept his hand there, feeling the absolute solidity of it, the way it seemed to draw warmth from his skin. This was good ice, clear and dense, the kind that would last well into spring if properly stored in the depths of the ice house. The work itself held a meditation quality that Oswald had long appreciated. He positioned himself near a section of ice that seemed particularly clear and smooth, then lifted the long-handled hook. The tool's weight balanced perfectly in his hands. The blacksmith, Brother Reinhard, had forged it with care, understanding through years of cooperation exactly what was needed. Oswald raised the hook and brought it down firmly against the ice. The impact sent a sharp crack echoing across the marsh, followed by a sound like breaking pottery as the surface fractured in a star pattern from the point of impact. He struck again and again, working methodically, creating a series of breaks that would allow him to extract a manageable section. The rhythm of the work settled over him. Strike, assess, strike again, the pattern as familiar as the prayers that marked the day's hours. His weathered hands gripped the wooden handle with practiced ease, and he hummed plainchant melodies while working, the ancient phrases mixing with the sound of metal on ice. Around him, the marsh remained utterly still, as though holding its breath. When he had outlined a section roughly 2 feet square, Oswald set aside the hook and took up a smaller iron pry bar. This required more delicate work, sliding the flat end beneath the ice and applying gradual pressure to lever the section free from the pond below. The ice resisted at first, then suddenly released with a satisfying crack, and he found himself holding a thick, irregular slab that gleamed in the pale light. The weight of it pleased him, substantial and solid. He carried it carefully to the sledge and laid it down on the wooden surface, where it sat like a piece of clouded glass. Already he could see the slow changes beginning as the warmer air touched its surface, tiny droplets forming where frost melted and immediately refroze in different patterns. Oswald returned to the pond and began the process again. There was no hurry in his movements, no sense of urgency. The monastery's ice house was large, built to hold enough ice to last from winter through the following autumn, preserving milk, butter, and the occasional fish or meat that required keeping cool. Filling it was work that happened over many days, each trip to the marsh yielding several slabs that would be layered with straw and sawdust in the house's deep interior. By the time he had loaded 4 substantial pieces onto the sledge, the sun had fully risen, though its light remained diffuse behind a thin layer of clouds. The temperature held steady in that perfect range for ice work, cold enough that his harvest would not begin melting, but not so bitter that his fingers grew numb inside his woolen mittens. He straightened, stretching his back carefully, and looked across the marsh. Other ponds lay scattered across the low ground, each one a potential source of ice, but this first pond had always yielded the clearest, most reliable harvest. Something about its depth and the way it was sheltered from wind by the willow trees created ideal conditions. Oswald took up the rope attached to the sledge and settled it across his shoulder, feeling the familiar pressure. The first pull was always the most difficult, breaking the sledge free from whatever small bond had formed between its runners and the ground. Then momentum helped, and he began the steady walk back toward the monastery, the sledge gliding smoothly behind him across the frozen earth. The return journey offered time for his mind to wander in that pleasant, unfocused way that came with repetitive physical work. He thought about the ice house itself, that remarkable structure that seemed to hold winter even in the heat of August. The brothers who had designed it generations ago had possessed a deep understanding of how cold settled, how earth insulated, how proper ventilation could be balanced against the need to seal in the chill. The path rose gently through the gardens, and Oswald adjusted his pace accordingly, taking his time, letting his breathing remain steady and deep. His weathered hands maintained their grip on the rope, and the weight behind him felt satisfying, the tangible result of the morning's work. In the kitchen garden, he passed the beds where Brother Godwin would soon begin preparing for early spring plantings. Godwin was perhaps 10 years younger than Oswald, 31 years old, with a passion for herbs and vegetables that bordered on the devotional. The two of them often worked in companionable silence, Godwin tending his plants while Oswald made his ice runs in winter or repaired tools in the warmer months. The ice house came into view as Oswald rounded the corner of the main dormitory building. It sat partially sunken into a gentle slope, its entrance marked by a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The door stood open now, as he had left it, revealing the darkness within. Even from several paces away, he could feel the cold air flowing out, noticeably chillier than the winter morning itself. He guided the sledge to the entrance and paused to catch his breath fully before beginning the next phase of work. The interior of the ice house descended in a series of broad steps, leading down into a chamber perhaps 15 feet deep. The walls were lined with stones fitted so precisely that almost no mortar showed between them, and behind the stones, lay thick layers of earth that provided insulation. Oswald had left a tall candle burning in a sheltered alcove near the top of the steps, and its light flickered gently, creating shifting shadows on the stone. He lifted the first slab of ice, feeling its cold weight in his arms, and carefully made his way down the steps. His footing was sure despite the dim light. He had walked these steps countless times and knew each one's particular height and depth. The floor of the ice house held the previous week's harvest, perhaps 20 slabs already laid in careful rows and covered with a thick layer of straw. The straw came from the monastery's own fields, cut and dried the previous summer, and it served to insulate each piece of ice from its neighbors while allowing air to circulate. Oswald had learned the proper technique from the brother who had held this task before him, and he had refined it over the years through careful observation. He positioned the new slab at the end of an existing row, then climbed back up for the second piece. The work took on its own rhythm: carry, descend, place, ascend, repeat. Each trip down the steps brought him into air so cold it seemed to have substance, wrapping around him like a presence. His breath plumed thick and white in the candlelight. When all 4 slabs were positioned, Oswald fetched an armful of fresh straw from the supply kept in a shed near the ice house entrance. The straw rustled softly as he spread it over and between the new ice, its golden color bright against the blue-gray of the frozen slabs. The familiar scent of dried grass filled the chamber, mixing with the clean smell of ice and the faint mineral odor of the stone walls. With work complete for this trip, Oswald climbed back to the entrance and stood for a moment in the doorway, feeling the temperature difference between the ice house's interior and the winter air outside. Even though both were cold, the ice house held a deeper chill, something that seemed to penetrate more thoroughly. He pulled the heavy door partially closed, leaving just enough gap for ventilation while keeping most of the cold contained within. The sledge waited empty, and Oswald considered making another trip to the marsh immediately. But his body suggested a different rhythm. Perhaps return to the cloister, take a cup of weak ale and a piece of bread, warm himself briefly by the kitchen fire. The ice would wait, patient and unchanging, and the day stretched ahead with ample time for another harvest before the afternoon prayers. He made his way to the kitchen, a long, low building attached to the refectory. The door opened easily under his push, and warmth flowed out to meet him, carrying the yeasty scent of bread and the herbal notes of the pottage that simmered eternally over the fire. Brother Aldric, the kitchen master, looked up from where he was kneading dough at the long wooden table. Aldric was 60 years old, with flour perpetually dusting his hands and forearms. His face held the ruddiness of someone who spent their days near fire and ovens, and he possessed a gentle humor that manifested in the slight smile that seemed always to play at the corners of his mouth. "Does the ice yield well?" Aldric asked, his hands never stopping their rhythmic work in the dough. "Clear and thick," Oswald replied, moving toward the fire where a pot of ale stood warming at the edge of the hearth. "The cold nights have served us well." "They have served you," Aldric said with that hint of smile widening slightly. "Some of us merely endure them while baking bread." Oswald poured himself a wooden cup of ale, feeling the warmth of the vessel in his cold hands. He drank slowly, letting the liquid's mild heat spread through him. The ale was weak, as was proper for daily consumption, made from the second running of mash, but it held notes of grain and a faint sweetness that satisfied. Aldric shaped his dough into rounds and set them to rise under clean linen cloths, then wiped his hands and cut a thick slice from yesterday's loaf. He handed it to Oswald without ceremony. The bread was dense and dark, made primarily of rye with some wheat mixed in, its crust firm and its interior still moist enough to be pleasant. The two brothers stood in comfortable silence, Oswald eating his bread while Aldric added wood to the fire with practiced efficiency. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing light across the kitchen's stone floor. Somewhere in the back of the kitchen, a cat, the monastery kept several to control mice, moved among the storage baskets with careful deliberation. "Will you make another trip before next?" Aldric asked, referring to the midday prayer service. Oswald considered, chewing thoughtfully. "One more, I think. The morning is still young, and the sledge moves easily over the frozen ground." "Take care on the marsh," Aldric said, as he always did, his tone carrying no real worry but rather the automatic concern of one friend for another. "I will," Oswald replied, as he always did, the exchange a comfortable ritual between them. When the bread was finished and the warmth had settled into his bones, Oswald returned to collect the sledge. The morning had advanced perhaps an hour, the light brightening slightly though the clouds remained unchanged. He retraced his path through the kitchen gardens, past the dormant beds and the frost-covered paths, back toward the marshlands where the ponds waited. The second journey to the marsh felt easier than the first, as such journeys often did. His body had found its working rhythm, and his mind drifted in that pleasant state between focus and reverie. He noticed things he had missed on the first walk, a cluster of winter berries still clinging to a hawthorn bush, their dark red color vivid against the pale landscape. The track of some small animal, perhaps a hare, pressed into the frost near the path's edge. At the pond, he resumed his work with the same measured patience. The hook rose and fell, creating new fracture patterns across the ice's surface. The sound carried differently now, seeming sharper in the mid-morning air. Oswald worked at a section adjacent to where he had harvested earlier, noting how the ice here showed slightly different characteristics. A few more bubbles suspended within, evidence of reeds growing beneath the surface. He extracted 5 pieces this time, each one requiring its own particular attention. One slab had an interesting inclusion, a small twig frozen perfectly in the center, suspended as if in amber. Oswald examined it with mild curiosity before laying it on the sledge with the others. Such imperfections made no difference to the ice's utility, and there was something appealing about these small reminders that what he harvested had once been living water, home to pond creatures and growing things. The sun broke through the clouds briefly as he prepared to return, sending long shadows stretching across the marsh. The light transformed the frost into countless tiny prisms, each one catching and reflecting the pale rays. Oswald paused to appreciate the sight, his weathered hands resting on the sledge's edge. These moments of unexpected beauty were gifts that required no response beyond simple observation. The walk back took longer with the heavier load, but Oswald maintained his steady pace. He focused on his breathing, keeping it even and deep, feeling his heart beating in his chest with that strong, regular rhythm that spoke of good health and honest work. His legs carried him reliably up the gentle rise, through the gardens where shadows now fell differently than they had an hour before. Brother Godwin had emerged from morning prayers and was examining the herb beds with an attention that bordered on the reverential. He straightened as Oswald approached, his own breath visible in the cold air. "A good harvest?" Godwin asked. He was 31 years old, with ink-stained fingers from his work in the scriptorium, and a thoughtful manner that made him easy company. "Very good," Oswald confirmed, pausing briefly. "The ice is clear and thick this year." "God provides," Godwin said simply, then gestured toward the dormant beds. "I was thinking that when spring comes, we might try planting the fennel earlier. The seeds arrived from the market town last week. Brother Martin brought them back from his supply journey." They spoke for a few moments about the coming growing season, though spring felt impossibly distant on this frozen morning. Oswald found he enjoyed these brief exchanges, the way the monastery's work wove together across seasons and tasks. His ice gathering in winter would preserve the herbs Godwin grew in summer, which Brother Aldric would use in his cooking, which nourished all the brothers for their various labors. At the ice house, Oswald repeated the process of carrying each slab down into the cold chamber. The candle had burned lower but still provided adequate light. He worked methodically, his movements efficient but never hurried. Each piece of ice was positioned with care, and fresh straw was scattered generously between the layers. When the last slab was settled and covered, Oswald stood in the ice house's depths and simply breathed the cold air for a long moment. The chill surrounded him completely, penetrating through his wool clothing, but it was not unpleasant. There was something purifying about it, something that felt ancient and patient. The ice here would last months, slowly diminishing as portions were carried up for use, but always present, a reserve of winter held against the heat of summer days still far in the future. He climbed the steps slowly, his knees protesting slightly now after the repeated trips up and down. At the top, he adjusted the door again, checking that it sat properly in its frame. The iron hinges were cold under his touch, their metal darker than the surrounding stone. The morning's work was essentially complete. There would be more harvesting in the days to come. The ice house could hold 3 or 4 times what currently rested in its depths, but for today, enough had been accomplished. Oswald felt the satisfaction that came with tasks properly executed, with good work done in good time. He made his way to the cloister, that covered walkway that ran around the central garth, the open courtyard at the monastery's heart. The cloister was where brothers often walked in contemplation between the hours of prayer, and it provided a sheltered path between the main buildings. The stone columns that supported its roof were carved with simple designs, worn smooth by decades of hands brushing against them. Oswald walked slowly along the cloister's length, his footsteps quiet on the flagstones. Through the columns, he could see across the garth to the church itself, its Norman architecture solid and enduring. The church's tower rose against the gray sky, its stones the same color as the winter clouds, so that building and sky seemed to merge at the edges. The bell for sext would ring soon, calling the brothers to midday prayer. Oswald found a stone bench set into an alcove along the cloister wall and lowered himself onto it, grateful for the chance to rest. The stone was cold even through his wool clothing, but he had grown accustomed to such discomforts. They were simply part of winter's reality. He sat with his weathered hands resting on his knees, his breathing gradually slowing from the exertion of the morning's work. His body felt pleasantly tired, the kind of tiredness that spoke of useful labor rather than exhaustion. He hummed plain chant melodies while sitting, the familiar phrases flowing through his mind like water following its natural course. A young novice passed through the cloister, arms laden with books being returned to the library. The boy, perhaps 16 years old, nodded respectfully to Oswald, who returned the acknowledgement with a slight smile. The novice moved on, his footsteps fading, leaving Oswald alone again with the silence. This silence was one of the monastery's greatest gifts, Oswald often thought. Not an empty silence, but one filled with subtle sounds, the distant murmur of wind, the occasional call of a winter bird, the soft settling of stones as temperature changed. It was a silence that made space for thoughts to surface and drift away without demanding attention. His mind wandered to the years he had spent in this place. He had arrived as a young man of 20, already knowing he sought a life of prayer and labor rather than the uncertainties of the world beyond the monastery walls. The decades since had passed in their rhythm of seasons and services, each year layering upon the previous ones like the ice he stored, each layer distinct yet part of a greater whole. The bell rang then, its bronze voice carrying across the monastery grounds. Oswald rose from the bench, his knees flexing carefully, and joined the flow of brothers making their way toward the church. They moved in silence, as was customary, each man wrapped in his own cloak, his own thoughts, his own quiet preparation for prayer. The church's interior held a different cold than the ice house, less intense but more pervasive, the chill of stone walls that rarely knew warmth. Oswald took his accustomed place in the choir, standing among the other lay brothers. The light filtering through the narrow windows cast long rectangles across the floor, and somewhere in the church's heights, a draft moved, creating a whisper of sound. The service unfolded in its timeless pattern, the chanted psalms, the prayers, the moments of silence that stretched like pools of still water. Oswald's voice joined with the others, the familiar Latin phrases requiring no conscious thought. His mind was present but also floating, aware of the cold stone beneath his feet, the scent of old incense that permeated the church's very walls, the way light shifted almost imperceptibly as clouds moved overhead. When the service concluded, the brothers filed out in the same measured silence they had entered with. Oswald returned to the cloister, but instead of heading to the refectory for the midday meal, he found himself drawn back toward the ice house. Not to work, he had harvested enough for today, but simply to check, to ensure the door was properly secured, to perform that final verification that good stewards always made. The walk across the grounds brought him past the monastery's vegetable storage shed, where roots and cabbages lay buried in sand and straw against the winter's needs. Past the woodshed, where split logs were stacked in careful rows, their cut ends showing the tree rings that marked years of growth. Past the dovecote, where the birds cooed softly among themselves, their presence both practical. They provided eggs and meat, and oddly comforting. At the ice house, everything was as he had left it. The door sat properly in its frame, the small gap he had left for ventilation unchanged. Oswald placed his hand on the wooden surface, feeling how cold had soaked into the timber, and nodded to himself. All was well. He turned to head toward the refectory, but paused when he noticed Brother Aldric approaching, carrying a covered basket. The kitchen master's face held its usual expression of gentle humor. "I thought you might have delayed your meal for one last check," Aldric said, coming to stand beside Oswald. "I brought you bread and cheese. The brothers are halfway through their portion already." "You know me well," Oswald replied, accepting the basket with gratitude. The warmth of fresh bread seeped through the cloth covering. 30 years of observing you at your work teaches a man something," Aldric said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "The ice house will serve us well again this year. You tend to do it with great care." Oswald felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the bread in his hands. Compliments were rare in monastic life, not because kindness was lacking, but because work was understood as offering to God rather than performance for human praise. When acknowledgement came, it carried weight. "The brothers who built it knew their craft," Oswald said. "I merely follow what they established." "Yes," Aldric agreed, "but you follow it faithfully. That is its own form of wisdom." They stood together in companionable silence, two men grown old in service, comfortable with each other's presence. Then Aldric nodded and turned back toward the kitchen, his stride unhurried, his bearing that of a man content with his place in the world's unfolding. Oswald found a sheltered spot near the ice house, where a small overhang of roof created a dry space out of any wind. He settled himself on a wooden bench that had been placed there for exactly this purpose, and uncovered the basket. Inside lay a thick portion of bread, wheat this time, lighter in color than the morning rye, along with a wedge of hard cheese and a small apple that had been stored since autumn, its skin wrinkled but still sound. He ate slowly, chewing thoroughly, tasting each element. The bread was still warm from the oven, its crust crackling softly as he bit into it. The cheese was sharp and crumbly, aged to that perfect point where flavor developed fully without bitterness. The apple was sweet with a slight tang, its flesh denser than it would have been when fresh but still pleasant. Between bites, Oswald watched the monastery grounds. A few brothers moved between buildings about their various tasks. Smoke rose from the bakehouse chimney, a thin column that dispersed gradually into the gray sky. From somewhere out of sight came the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood, the measured thunk of a meeting log, pause, then again, a meditation of sound. When the meal was finished, Oswald remained sitting, in no hurry to move. His body had settled into that state of pleasant tiredness that comes after good work and adequate food. His weathered hands lay relaxed in his lap, and he found himself humming plainchant melodies again, the ancient tunes emerging without conscious decision. The afternoon stretched ahead with its own rhythms, no prayer service, then perhaps an hour in the workshop where tools needed maintenance, then Vespers as evening approached. But for this moment, there was simply sitting simply being present in this particular span of winter afternoon, with cold air and distant sounds, and the satisfaction of ice safely stored against future needs. A robin appeared, hopping across the frozen ground nearby, its breast bright against the monochrome landscape. It cocked its head, regarding Oswald with one black eye, then resumed its search for whatever winter offerings the earth might provide. Oswald watched it with idle interest, noting the quick efficiency of its movements, the way it seemed completely adapted to the season's demands. Eventually, the cold penetrated even his wool layers sufficiently that movement became desirable. Oswald rose, collected the basket, and began walking toward the workshop. His legs had stiffened slightly during the sitting, but movement loosened them quickly. He passed through the kitchen to return the basket to Brother Aldric, exchanging a nod of thanks, then continued on to the workshop building. The workshop was a long structure with high windows that admitted good light. It smelled of wood shavings, metal, and oil, the accumulated sense of repairs and maintenance performed over generations. Tools hung on the walls in organized rows, each one in its designated place. A workbench ran along one wall, its surface scarred and stained from countless projects. Oswald had tools of his own that needed attention. The long-handled hook that served him so well in ice harvesting had developed a slight looseness where the metal joined the wood. Not dangerous yet, but better addressed before it became a problem. He selected the appropriate materials, a small wedge of hardwood, some tallow to seal the joint, and settled at the workbench to make the repair. The work was delicate, requiring attention but not intense concentration. He tapped the wooden wedge carefully into place, testing the tightness, tapping again, testing. The hook's handle was ash, chosen for its strength and flexibility, and the grain ran true along its length. When the wedge was properly seated, Oswald applied melted tallow to seal the joint against moisture, his weathered hands knowing exactly how much to use from long experience. As he worked, another lay brother entered the workshop, Thomas, 53 years old, whose primary task was maintaining the monastery's collection of carts and wagons. Thomas moved with the slight stiffness of someone whose back troubled him on cold days, but his hands remained steady and skilled. "Afternoon, Oswald," Thomas said, making his way to where a cart wheel stood propped against the wall, waiting for a new iron rim. "Afternoon," Oswald replied. "Your back is troubling you." "Less than yesterday," Thomas said with a slight grimace. "Brother Infirmarian gave me a liniment that helps. Smells like a stable, but it eases the ache." They worked in companionable silence, each focused on their own task, but aware of the other's presence in that comfortable way that develops between people who have shared space for years. The sounds of their work created a gentle rhythm, the tap of Oswald's mallet, the rasp of Thomas's file against metal, the occasional shift of weight or adjustment of position. The afternoon light began its subtle shift toward evening, the quality of illumination changing in ways more felt than seen. Through the workshop's high windows, the sky showed no dramatic color. Winter afternoons in this coastal region rarely did, but rather a gradual deepening of gray, a thickening of the air's texture. When Oswald's repair was complete, he tested the hook thoroughly, checking the joint from multiple angles, applying pressure to ensure it would hold under the stress of actual use. Satisfied, he hung it back in its designated spot on the workshop wall. The tool would serve him well for many more ice harvests through the remainder of this winter and the next. Thomas was still working on his wheel, the file moving in long, even strokes that produced a fine metal dust. Oswald watched for a moment, appreciating the other man's patience and precision, then gathered his materials and prepared to leave. "Good evening to you," he said to Thomas. "And to you," Thomas replied without looking up, his concentration on his work absolute. Outside, the air had grown noticeably colder as afternoon moved toward evening. Oswald pulled his cloak more tightly and made his way toward the church, where Vespers would soon be called. The monastery grounds had taken on that hushed quality that precedes the day's end, a drawing in, a settling. He paused at the cloister, stepping into its covered walkway and standing where he could see across the garth to the church beyond. The building's stone had darkened with the failing light, becoming more shadow than substance, defined more by its shape against the sky than by its actual surface. The bell rang, its voice familiar and centering. Oswald joined the flow of brothers, all moving toward the church for the evening office. Their collective footsteps created a soft shuffling sound, like leaves moved by gentle wind. No one spoke. The period before Vespers was traditionally held in silence, but there was communication nonetheless in the shared movement, the common purpose. Inside the church, the darkness was deeper than it had been at midday. Candles had been lit, their flames creating small pools of warm light that did little to penetrate the larger shadows, but which gave the space a sense of shelter, of refuge. Oswald took his place, his body knowing exactly where to stand, how to hold itself for the standing and kneeling that the service would require. The chanting began, voices rising in unison, the Latin phrases flowing in their ancient patterns. Oswald's voice joined the others, his throat producing sounds he had made countless times, his mind following the familiar paths of the Psalms. There was comfort in this repetition, in the knowledge that these same words had been spoken here for hundreds of years, that they would continue after he was gone, an unbroken chain of prayer stretching backward and forward through time. The service moved through its ordained structure, psalms and prayers, moments of silence and moments of collective voice, the whole thing lasting perhaps 30 minutes but feeling somehow outside of normal time, existing in its own rhythm that had little to do with the clock's measurement. When Vespers concluded, the brothers filed out into the gathering darkness. The day's work was essentially done. A light meal would be taken in the refectory, bread and ale, perhaps some dried fruit or nuts, and then the evening would be spent in quiet activities before complying, the final prayer service before sleep. Oswald moved with the others to the refectory, that long hall where the community took its meals. Trestle tables ran the length of the room, and benches lined both sides. The brothers took their seats in a silence broken only by the shuffle of wool on wood, the quiet settling of bodies after a day's labor. Brother Aldric and his assistants brought out the evening's offerings, loaves of dark bread, jugs of weak ale, wooden bowls filled with dried figs that had come by way of the autumn trade fairs. The meal was simple, as evening meals always were, designed to nourish without creating the heaviness that would interfere with sleep. Oswald ate his portion slowly, breaking the bread into small pieces and chewing thoroughly. The figs were sweet and chewy, their flavor concentrated by the drying process. The ale was barely alcoholic, more water than anything else, but it washed down the bread and fruit adequately. Around him, the other brothers ate with similar deliberation. There was no conversation. Meals were taken in silence except on feast days, but the shared act of eating created its own communion. These men, gathered in this place, sustained by this food, all part of the same ongoing prayer that was their communal life. When the meal ended, the brothers dispersed to their evening activities. Some went to the library to read before the light failed completely. Others gathered in the warming room, the one place where a fire burned freely and conversation was permitted. A few retreated to the church for private prayer. Oswald found himself drawn to the cloister again. He walked its circuit slowly, his hands tucked into his sleeves against the cold, his mind quiet and receptive. The darkness was nearly complete now, with only the faintest residue of daylight lingering at the western horizon. Stars had begun to appear overhead, visible through the gaps between clouds, bright points in the vast darkness. He completed 3 circuits of the cloister, his footsteps creating a soft rhythm on the stones. With each pass, he felt the day settling into his body, becoming a memory rather than immediate experience. The morning's ice harvest, the walks to and from the marsh, the repairs in the workshop, the services that punctuated everything, all of it folding into the ongoing fabric of his life here. On his final circuit, he encountered Brother Godwin, also walking the cloister in his own contemplation. They fell into step together without speaking, 2 men comfortable enough with each other that words were unnecessary. They walked in synchronization, their strides matching, their breaths visible in the cold air, twin plumes that rose and dispersed. When they reached the point where their paths naturally diverged, Godwin heading to the dormitory, Oswald toward the church for a few moments of private prayer before complying. They paused and exchanged a nod. Still no words, but understanding passed between them nonetheless. Oswald entered the church alone. The candles from Vespers had burned low, creating a dimness that was almost complete. He made his way to a small side chapel, a space barely large enough for 3 or 4 people, and knelt on the cold stone floor. His knees protested the contact, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the silence that surrounded him. He remained there for a span of time he didn't measure, kneeling in the darkness, his weathered hands clasped loosely before him. He formed no specific prayers in words, but rather let his mind rest in that space of openness that was itself a form of prayer. Images drifted through his awareness: the blue-gray ice, the frost on the garden beds, the robin hopping across frozen ground, the warm bread in his hands, each one present for a moment and then releasing. The bell for Compline rang, calling him back from his solitude. Oswald rose carefully, his knees stiff from kneeling, and made his way to his place in the choir. The brothers assembled for this final service of the day, their faces barely visible in the dim light, their forms more sensed than seen. Compline was the briefest of the daily offices, designed to send the community into sleep with prayer fresh on their lips. The chanting was subdued, almost whispered, the words falling like soft rain in the darkness. Oswald's voice joined the others, speaking of protection through the night, of trust in the dawn that would come, of the eternal presence that held all things. When the service ended, the brothers filed out in complete silence. This was the beginning of the great silence that would last until morning prayers, a time when no speech was permitted except in cases of urgent necessity. They moved through the darkness toward the dormitory, shadows among shadows, each man turning inward toward the rest that awaited. The dormitory was a long room lined with simple beds, wooden frames supporting rope webbing and straw mattresses covered with wool blankets. Each bed was separated from its neighbor by a few feet of space, minimal privacy but sufficient for sleep. Oswald made his way to his bed, one he had occupied for so many years that his body knew exactly how many steps it required, exactly where to turn, exactly when to reach out to find the wooden frame. He removed his outer garments, the cloak, the heavier tunic, folding them and laying them at the foot of the bed as he always did. He kept on his lighter under tunic and hose for warmth. The dormitory was cold, though not as cold as the outdoors, and the wool blankets would provide adequate comfort once he was beneath them. Oswald settled onto the bed, the rope webbing creaking slightly under his weight, the straw rustling as it compressed. He pulled the blankets over himself, feeling their familiar weight and texture. Around him, he could hear the other brothers making their own preparations, soft sounds of cloth moving, ropes creaking, straw settling, an occasional cough or shift of position. He lay on his back, his weathered hands resting on his chest, and looked up into the darkness where the dormitory's ceiling existed but could not be seen. His body felt the day's labor now, a pleasant ache in his shoulders and lower back, a deep tiredness in his legs, a sense of muscles that had been well used and were ready for rest. His mind drifted over the day once more, not analyzing or judging but simply acknowledging. The ice house would serve the community well through the coming seasons. The tools were maintained and ready. The rhythm of prayer had held everything in its proper place. All was as it should be. Oswald's breath gradually slowed as he lay beneath the wool blankets, his body releasing the last tensions of the day. Around him, the dormitory settled into its nighttime quiet, not absolute silence, but rather a tapestry of small sounds that spoke of human presence at rest. Someone shifted in their bed, rope creaking softly. Another brother's breathing had already deepened into the rhythmic pattern of sleep. The building itself seemed to exhale, stones contracting slightly in the cold, timber beams settling with faint whispers. Sleep came easily, as it usually did after days of honest labor. Oswald drifted into it like a leaf carried on slow water, his consciousness loosening its grip on waking concerns. His dreams, when they came, were simple images of ice and light, the marsh ponds reflecting pale sky, his weathered hands working with tools whose weight and balance were as familiar as his own heartbeat. The night passed in its ancient rhythm. At some point, perhaps midnight, perhaps later, Oswald surfaced briefly into wakefulness, aware of the cold air on his face and the warmth cocooned beneath his blankets. He heard the distant bell for matins, the night office, but as a lay brother rather than choir monk, he was not required to rise for it. The sound reached him as something both present and far away, a reminder of prayer continuing even in darkness. He let it wash over him and sank back into sleep's embrace. When he next woke, it was to the bell for lauds, the dawn office that marked the beginning of a new day. The dormitory remained dark, but there was a quality to the darkness that suggested morning's approach, a thinning at the edges, a sense of the world preparing to reveal itself once more. Oswald lay still for a moment, that space between sleep and full waking, then pushed back his blankets and rose. The cold bit immediately through his light tunic, and he reached for his heavier garments, pulling them on with movements made smooth by countless repetitions. Around him, other brothers were doing the same, dark shapes moving in the dimness, no one speaking but all aware of each other's presence. Someone stifled a cough. Another brother's joints cracked audibly as he stood and stretched. Oswald made his way through the dormitory to the door that led outside. The flagstones were ice cold beneath his feet, even through his leather shoes. He stepped out into the morning darkness, feeling the shock of the outdoor air against his face. The sky showed no hint of dawn yet, but the quality of the night had changed. It was the darkness before light rather than the darkness of full night. He joined the flow of brothers moving toward the church for lauds. Their collective footsteps created a soft sound, a gentle percussion that marked human movement through the stillness. The church's bulk loomed ahead, darker than the surrounding darkness, defined by the absence of stars where its shape blocked the sky. Inside, candles had been lit in preparation for the service. Their flames seemed to burn more steadily in the pre-dawn stillness, creating pools of golden light that gathered the community. Oswald took his place, his body finding the standing position it would hold through the service, his mind settling into the receptive state that prayer required. The office began with its opening verse, voices rising in unison from the darkness. The psalms of lauds were those of dawn and new beginning, speaking of light breaking over darkness, of the sun's faithful return, of creation renewed each morning. Oswald's voice joined the others, the Latin words flowing in patterns so deeply learned they required no conscious thought. Between psalms came the readings, brief passages from scripture or the writings of the desert fathers, and periods of silence where the words could settle. The silence was full rather than empty, charged with the collective attention of men whose primary work was prayer. Oswald stood in it, breathing slowly, aware of the cold air filling his lungs, the stone floor beneath his feet, the presence of his brothers on either side. As the service progressed, the first genuine light began to appear. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, a lessening of the darkness rather than the arrival of brightness. The church's narrow windows began to show themselves as lighter rectangles against the stone walls. Colors started to separate from the uniform gray, the brown of wooden benches, the darker brown of the brothers' habits, the pale stone of the columns. When lauds concluded, the brothers filed out into a morning that had arrived fully, though the sun itself remained hidden behind thick clouds. The light was flat and even, shadowless, turning the monastery grounds into a study in subtle grays and browns. Frost covered everything once more, sparkling faintly where the light caught it. Oswald made his way to the necessarium, that practical building where the brothers attended to their bodily needs, then to the lavatorium for the morning washing. The water in the stone basins was numbingly cold, barely above freezing, but the shock of it against his face and hands brought full wakefulness. He dried himself on the communal linen towel, feeling how the rough fabric scraped pleasantly against his skin. Prime, the first daylight office, followed soon after. Oswald returned to the church for this briefer service. Then finally the community gathered in the refectory for the morning meal. Breakfast was simple, bread left over from yesterday's baking, made more palatable by toasting over the kitchen fire, accompanied by weak ale and occasionally a bit of cheese. Brother Aldric moved among the tables with his assistants, ensuring each brother received their portion. When he reached Oswald, he paused and spoke quietly. Conversation was permitted during the morning meal. "The kitchen requires ice today," Aldric said. "We have butter that needs keeping and some fish that arrived yesterday from the coast." "I will bring it after terce," Oswald replied, grateful for the specific direction the day was taking. The morning's ice delivery would be followed by another harvest from the marsh, continuing the steady work of building up the ice house's reserves. After the meal, the community gathered once more for a terrace, the mid-morning office. Then the day's work truly began, each brother dispersing to their assigned tasks. Oswald made his way to the ice house, taking with him a wooden pail and a small hand saw that he kept specifically for cutting portions from the stored ice. He opened the ice house door fully, allowing the morning light to penetrate the entrance. The cold air flowed out, and Oswald descended the steps carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. The candle he lit cast moving shadows on the stone walls, and he could see his breath thick and white in its light. The ice he had stored yesterday lay as he had left it, the straw covering undisturbed. Oswald lifted away the straw from one of the clearer pieces and examined it with satisfaction. The slab had developed a thin coating of frost on its surface, but underneath remained solid and pristine. He positioned the saw and began cutting, the teeth biting into the ice with a distinctive sound, part crunch, part squeak, that echoed slightly in the chamber. He cut several smaller pieces, each one manageable enough to carry up the steps. The work required attention. Ice was slippery, and the saw could bind if not used carefully, but it was work his weathered hands knew well. When he had cut sufficient pieces, he gathered them in the pail, layering them with fresh straw to prevent them from freezing together during transport. The walk to the kitchen carried him through morning light that had strengthened slightly, though the sun remained hidden. He noticed that the frost on the herb garden beds had begun to melt when exposed to what pale warmth the day offered, creating tiny droplets that clung to the dried stalks like miniature jewels. In the kitchen, Brother Aldric received the ice with his characteristic efficiency, transferring the pieces to a stone-lined cold box built into the north wall where temperature stayed consistently low. The butter and fish were already waiting, wrapped in clean linen. "This will serve well," Aldric said, positioning the fish on a bed of ice. "We will have good eating tomorrow if the cold holds." "It will hold," Oswald said with the certainty of someone who had watched countless winter patterns. "This cold has the feeling of settling in for days yet." He remained in the kitchen for a few moments, warming his hands near the fire where a new batch of bread was baking. The heat felt good after the ice house's chill, and the smell of the bread was rich and yeasty, speaking of nourishment and care. Aldric worked at his table, shaping dough with those flour-dusted hands that seemed never to be entirely clean. "Will you return to the marsh today?" Aldric asked without looking up from his work. "After I warm through," Oswald replied. "The sledge is ready and the ponds still have good ice to yield." "Take bread with you," Aldric said, and cut a generous portion from a cooled loaf, wrapping it in cloth. "The cold makes a man hungry." Oswald accepted the offering with a nod of thanks, tucking it into the leather pouch he wore at his belt. These small kindnesses between brothers, the offered bread, the concern for warmth, the acknowledgement of work undertaken, were the everyday manifestations of the caritas, the love that was meant to bind the community together. When he felt sufficiently warmed, Oswald collected his sledge and set out once more for the marsh. The path through the kitchen gardens showed more evidence of the frost's retreat, patches of bare earth appearing where the sun's angle allowed stronger light to reach. But the marsh itself, lying in lower ground and shaded by willow trees, would remain frozen for weeks yet. The walk had become meditative through repetition. Oswald's mind did not need to attend to navigation. His feet knew the way. Instead, he found himself noticing details that had escaped his attention on previous journeys. A pattern in the bark of an apple tree that resembled flowing water. The precise angle at which frozen grass bent under its coating of ice. The way his own shadow, cast by the diffuse light, had soft edges that blurred into the surrounding frost. At the pond, he resumed the work with the same patient rhythm. The hook rose and fell. Fracture patterns spread across the ice's surface. Sections were pried free and loaded onto the sledge. His breathing remained steady throughout, his body settling into the work's demands. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, the ancient tunes providing their own kind of companionship. This harvest yielded 6 pieces of good quality ice, each one clear enough to see through, each one thick enough to last well into the warmer months. Oswald examined each piece briefly before loading it, appreciating the way light moved through the frozen water, the way bubbles and small imperfections created landscapes within the transparent depths. By the time he had filled the sledge, the morning had advanced toward midday. Oswald paused to eat the bread Brother Aldric had given him, standing at the pond's edge and chewing slowly. The bread was dense and satisfying, still holding a hint of warmth from the kitchen. He watched a small flock of winter birds, sparrows perhaps, or finches, moving through the bare willow branches, their quick movements and soft chirping a reminder that life continued even in the cold season's depths. The return journey with his loaded sledge took him past Brother Godwin, who was examining the monastery's beehives. The hives stood silent now, their inhabitants clustered deep within for warmth, but Godwin checked them regularly nevertheless, ensuring the structures remained sound and weatherproof. "How do they fare?" Oswald asked, pausing with his sledge. "Well enough," Godwin replied. He was 31 years old, and his ink-stained fingers looked incongruous as they traced the wooden slats of a hive. They cluster well. I can hear the hum when I place my ear against the wood, very faint but steady. They generate their own warmth, you know, through the movement of their wings. A remarkable arrangement, Oswald said, genuinely interested. The mysteries of how creatures adapted to winter's demands had always fascinated him. It is, Godwin agreed. Come spring, they will emerge as if no time had passed. Patient waiting, then sudden activity. There is something to learn in that pattern. They spoke for a few moments more about the spring that would eventually come, the return of flowers for the bees, the greening of the herb beds, the lengthening of days. Then Oswald resumed his journey to the ice house, the sledge gliding smoothly behind him. The work of storing the ice had become almost automatic through repetition. Descend the steps, position each piece carefully, add straw, ascend, repeat. Yet Oswald brought full attention to each iteration, knowing that carelessness could lead to a misplaced foot on the cold stone, a dropped piece of ice, and unnecessary waste. The work deserved respect, even in its familiarity. When the last piece was settled and the ice house door adjusted to its proper position, Oswald stood for a moment in the growing light. The sun had begun to break through the clouds in places, sending shafts of pale illumination across the monastery grounds. Where the light touched, surfaces seemed to come alive, the stone walls gaining texture and depth, the frost glittering with renewed intensity, shadows appearing where before everything had been uniformly gray. The bell for sext rang, calling the community to midday prayer. Oswald made his way to the church, joining the flow of brothers converging from their various labors. In the choir, he took his place and added his voice to the psalms. The service moved through its familiar structure, and when it concluded, the brothers proceeded to the refectory for the main meal of the day. Dinner was more substantial than breakfast. A thick pottage made from dried peas and onions, seasoned with herbs from the previous summer's harvest. Bread accompanied it, along with cheese and the ever-present weak ale. The brothers ate with appetites sharpened by morning work, and though conversation was limited during meals, the shared experience of eating created its own form of communion. After dinner came a brief period of rest, not sleep, but quieter activity before the afternoon's work resumed. Some brothers returned to the warming room to sit near the fire. Others walked the cloister in gentle exercise. Oswald found himself drawn to the library, that room where the monastery's collection of books was kept. The library was quieter even than the church, if such a thing were possible. It held perhaps 50 volumes, a significant collection for a house of this size, each one copied by hand, each one representing countless hours of labor by scribes in this monastery or others. The room smelled of parchment and leather, of ink and the cedar chips used to repel insects, of time itself somehow made tangible. Oswald was not a scholar. His Latin was functional but not elegant, his reading slow and careful. But he appreciated the presence of these books, the way they held knowledge and prayer in forms that could survive their creators. He ran his weathered hands along the spines, feeling the leather bindings, some smooth with age, others still showing the texture of the animal they had once covered. Brother Benedict, the librarian, sat at a small desk near the window, making entries in the catalog that tracked the collection. He was 47 years old, with a scholar's stoop and eyes that watered in bright light. He looked up as Oswald entered and offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Looking for something particular?" Benedict asked, his voice barely above a whisper, even though conversation was permitted in the library. "No," Oswald replied, equally quiet, "simply appreciating." Benedict smiled slightly, understanding. That is its own form of reading. Oswald selected a psalter, a book containing the psalms that formed the backbone of the daily offices, and carried it to a bench near the window where light was best. He opened it carefully, the vellum pages smooth under his fingertips. The script was beautiful, the work of a skilled scribe, each letter formed with care, decorated initials marking the beginning of each psalm. He read slowly, following the Latin with his finger, speaking the words silently in his mind. These were psalms he knew by heart from years of daily recitation, but seeing them written gave them a different quality. The permanence of the ink on parchment, the deliberate beauty of the lettering, these spoke of prayer as something worthy of the finest craft, of words addressed to God deserving humanity's best efforts. Time passed quietly. The afternoon light shifted across the library floor, the angle changing as the sun progressed on its winter arc. Oswald turned pages, occasionally paused to simply look at a particularly beautiful initial letter or to rest his eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the occasional scratch of Benedict's pen as he made his catalog entries. Eventually, the angle of the light told Oswald that none, the mid-afternoon office, approached. He closed the psalter carefully, returning it to its designated place on the shelf, and made his way once more to the church. The service was brief, as the afternoon offices tended to be, but it served its purpose of marking time's passage and returning the community's collective attention to prayer. After none, Oswald returned to his work. There were tools in the workshop that needed sharpening. The ice hook's blade had dulled slightly from use against the frozen surface, and the hand saw could benefit from attention. He collected the tools and made his way to the workshop, where the whetstone waited. The work of sharpening was meditative in its own right. The circular motion of stone against metal, the gradual appearance of a keener edge, the sound it made, part scrape, part whisper, all combined to create a focus that was both complete and relaxed. Oswald worked steadily, checking the edge regularly with his thumb, careful not to press too hard, simply gauging the sharpness by the way it caught against his skin. Thomas was in the workshop again, still working on his cart wheel. The project had progressed. The iron rim now fitted properly, and he was securing it with small metal pins driven through pre-drilled holes. The work required precision and patience, qualities Thomas possessed in abundance despite the back pain that sometimes troubled him. "How is it?" Oswald asked after they had worked in silence for some time. "Well enough," Thomas replied, pausing to stretch carefully. "This wheel will outlast me, I think. The ironwork is sound and the wood is good seasoned oak." "A comfort," Oswald said, "to know one's work will continue beyond oneself." "Yes," Thomas agreed. though sometimes I wonder if anyone will remember who fitted this particular rim, or if it will simply be an anonymous wheel doing its work without history. The work itself is the remembrance, Oswald said, running his thumb along the newly sharpened hook blade with satisfaction. Each task done well honors all who taught us the doing of it. They returned to their separate labors, but the brief exchange had created a warmth that had nothing to do with the workshop's temperature. This was another gift of communal life. These moments of connection, brief but genuine, that reminded each brother he was part of something larger than his individual existence. When the hook and saw were properly sharpened, Oswald returned them to their places in the ice house shed and considered his next task. The afternoon was advancing toward evening, and Vespers would come in perhaps 2 hours. He decided to make one more check of the ice house itself, not because he doubted his earlier work, but because the checking had become part of his rhythm, a completion of the day's cycle. The ice house door opened smoothly under his hand. He lit a candle and descended once more into the cold chamber. Everything was as it should be, the ice stacked in its careful layers, the straw providing insulation, the walls dry and sound. He stood in the center of the space, breathing the cold air, feeling how it seemed to hold a different kind of silence than the outdoor air, something more absolute. His weathered hands rested at his sides, and for a moment he allowed himself simply to be present in this space that he tended. The ice represented provision for the community, practical care made tangible. But it also represented something else, the human capacity to work with natural rhythms, to store winter's cold against summer's heat, to plan and provide and tend with patience. He climbed back to the surface and closed the door, adjusting it to its proper position with the small ventilation gap. The afternoon light had taken on that particular quality of winter's end of day, not golden like summer evenings, but a kind of silvering, a softening of all edges and colors into harmonious gray. Oswald walked to the cloister and began his afternoon circuits. Other brothers had the same idea, and soon several men moved around the covered walkway, each at their own pace, each wrapped in their own thoughts but aware of the other's presence. They passed each other regularly, exchanging nods but no words, the walking itself sufficient purpose. On his third circuit, Oswald found himself walking alongside Brother Godwin once more. They fell into step naturally, their strides matching without conscious effort. The day was ending as it had begun, in companionship and silence, in the rhythm of feet on stone, in the gradual dimming of light and the gathering of cold. They completed another full circuit together before Godwin broke the silence, his voice quiet and contemplative. "I was thinking about the cycles," Godwin said. "How your work with ice mirrors what I do with plants. Both of us gather in one season what will be needed in another." Oswald considered this, his weathered hands tucked into his sleeves against the cold. "Yes," he said after a moment, "the ice I store now will cool your herbs come summer when you harvest them for drying. And the herbs I dry," Godwin continued, "will season the food that gives you strength to harvest more ice next winter. Everything connects, circles back." They walked on in silence for a time, contemplating this observation. It was true. The monastery's life was woven of such interconnections, each brother's work supported and supported by the work of others, all of it forming a fabric stronger than any individual thread. "There is comfort in that," Oswald said eventually. "Knowing one's labor serves purposes beyond what one can see at the moment." Godwin nodded, and they continued their walking until the bell for Vespers called them toward the church once more. The evening office unfolded in its timeless pattern, the psalms of dusk and approaching night, the prayers of protection through darkness. When it concluded, the brothers made their way to the refectory for the evening meal. The meal was simple as always, bread and cheese, some preserved plums from the previous autumn, weak ale. Oswald ate slowly, aware of the pleasant tiredness in his body, the accumulation of 2 days' good work. His muscles ached in that satisfying way that spoke of proper use, and the food, simple as it was, tasted particularly good. After the meal, instead of returning to the warming room or the cloister, Oswald felt drawn to step outside briefly before complying. He walked to a spot near the ice house where the view opened toward the marsh and the lands beyond. The evening had deepened into near darkness, though a faint glow remained at the western horizon where the sun had disappeared. The cold was intense now, that deep chill that comes when the earth releases the day's minimal warmth back to the sky. Oswald's breath came in thick clouds, and frost was already beginning to form again on surfaces that had melted during the day. He stood still, simply experiencing the night's arrival, the way the world transformed in the absence of light. Stars were emerging overhead, visible through gaps in the clouds. Oswald recognized some of the patterns, the knowledge passed down from brother to brother, the same stars that travelers used for navigation. He found the North Star, steady and reliable, and traced the shapes around it. The vastness above created a curious double feeling, his own smallness in the face of such immensity, and simultaneously a sense of connection to something infinite and enduring. A sound reached him from the direction of the marsh, the call of some night bird, lonely and clear in the cold air. It came once, twice, then fell silent. Oswald waited to see if it would call again, but only silence followed. The bird had said what it needed to say and moved on. He remained outside a while longer, until the cold penetrated even his wool layers and made continuing uncomfortable. Then he turned and walked back toward the main buildings, where candlelight showed in some windows, warm points of light against the darkness. The monastery felt like a vessel of warmth and human presence floating in the vast cold night, and Oswald felt grateful for its shelter. The bell for Compline rang, gathering the community one final time. Oswald joined the others in the church, where the darkness was held back only by a handful of candles, their flames steady in the still air. The service was brief and subdued, the words familiar and comforting, speaking of rest and trust and the promise of morning's return. When it ended, the great silence began. The brothers filed out without speaking, moving through the darkness to the dormitory. Oswald prepared for sleep with the same careful economy of movement as the night before, removing outer garments, folding them, settling onto his bed beneath the wool blankets. The straw mattress rustled as he found his position, lying on his back with his weathered hands resting on his chest. The day had been good, Work accomplished, prayers said, community maintained. Oswald felt the deep contentment that came from living according to his vocation, from finding his place in the ordered rhythm of monastic life. His body was tired but satisfied, ready for the restoration that sleep would bring. Around him, the dormitory settled into its nighttime sounds. The darkness was complete now, so absolute that Oswald could not see his own hand when he held it before his face. But he knew exactly where he was, in his bed, in the dormitory, in the monastery, in the landscape of marsh and field and coast, under the vast arch of stars. Each layer of location contained and supported him. Sleep came easily once more, drawing him down into its depths. His last conscious thought was of ice, clear and blue and patient, waiting in the darkness of the ice house, holding winter for the seasons yet to come. The night passed in its ancient rhythm. Oswald woke once briefly, surfacing just enough to hear the bell for matins in the distance, then sinking back into sleep's embrace. His dreams were peaceful when they came, images of light on water, of frost patterns on glass, of paths walked so often they had become part of his body's knowledge. Dawn arrived as it always did, gradually and without fanfare. The bell for lauds pulled Oswald back to waking, and he rose into another day that would be much like the one before, and much like the one that would follow. This was not monotony, but rather the deep rhythm of a life dedicated to prayer and work, each day a variation on eternal themes. He dressed in the darkness and joined the flow of brothers moving toward the church. The service unfolded, the psalms of dawn rising into the cold air. Light began to seep into the world, revealing the monastery grounds under a fresh coating of frost. When lauds ended, the community moved through prime and breakfast, then gathered for terce before dispersing to their morning labors. Oswald made his way to the ice house, bringing the tools he would need for another day's harvest. The pattern was established now: morning delivery of ice to the kitchen, journey to the marsh for new harvest, storage in the ice house, maintenance of tools, the cycle of offices punctuating everything. It was a pattern he could follow with confidence, knowing each step, trusting the rhythm. At the marsh, the ponds waited under their coating of ice. The morning light made the frozen surface gleam, and when Oswald struck it with his hook, the sound rang out clear and sharp across the empty landscape. He worked steadily, cutting and loading, his breath visible in the cold air, his weathered hands sure on the tools. A fox appeared at the edge of the marsh while he worked, a sudden presence, still and watchful. It regarded Oswald with amber eyes, assessing whether he represented threat or opportunity. Finding him neither, it moved on, trotting across the frozen ground with that peculiar gait of foxes, leaving delicate tracks in the frost. Oswald watched it disappear among the willow trees and returned to his work, pleased by the brief encounter. The day unfolded according to its established pattern. Ice was harvested and stored. Meals were taken at their appointed times. The offices marked the hours, sext at midday, none in mid-afternoon, Vespers as evening approached. Between these fixed points there was work and prayer, conversation and silence, movement and rest, all woven together into the fabric of communal life. In the late afternoon, after none, Oswald found himself once more in the workshop. Brother Reinhard the blacksmith was there, working on some repairs to one of the kitchen's iron pot hangers. Reinhard was 58 years old, with massive forearms and hands scarred from years of working with hot metal. Despite his strength and the nature of his craft, he moved with surprising delicacy when the work required it. "Your ice hook serves you well," Reinhard asked, glancing up from his work. "Very well," Oswald confirmed. "The balance is perfect. My hands know exactly where to grip it for best leverage." "Good," Reinhard said with satisfaction. "A tool should become part of the hand that uses it. When I forge something new, I think about how it will be held, how the weight will feel during long use. A tool that fights its user is no tool at all." "You have a gift for it," Oswald said, meaning it sincerely. Reinhard shrugged, uncomfortable with direct praise as most of the brothers were. "God provides the gifts. We merely steward them in whatever way we can." They worked in companionable silence for a time, Reinhard's hammer creating its rhythmic sound against the anvil, Oswald performing maintenance on the sledge's runners, checking for splinters or cracks that might need attention. The workshop held the accumulated warmth of Reinhard's forge, making it one of the more comfortable spaces in the monastery during winter. Eventually, Oswald completed his inspection, finding the sledge sound and ready for continued service. He put away his tools and prepared to leave, but paused at the workshop door to watch Reinhard for a moment longer. There was something meditative about the blacksmith's work, the heating and shaping of metal, the transformation of raw material into useful form, the marriage of strength and precision. "Thank you," Oswald said, though for what exactly he couldn't have articulated. Perhaps for the well-made tool, perhaps for the example of craftsmanship, perhaps simply for being another thread in the monastery's fabric. Reinhard looked up and nodded, understanding without need for explanation. "God's peace to you," he said. "And to you," Oswald replied, stepping out into the late afternoon cold. The sky had cleared during the day, and now, as evening approached, it showed that deep blue clarity that comes only in winter when the air is cold and dry. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows across the monastery grounds, and everything seemed outlined with particular sharpness, edges more defined, textures more apparent, the whole world rendered in high contrast. Oswald walked to the cloister and began his evening circuits. The stone columns cast bars of shadow across the walkway, and his footsteps echoed softly in the enclosed space. Other brothers were also walking. Brother Benedict from the library, Brother Thomas with his careful gait that favored his back, young Brother Aelred, who had only recently taken his vows. They passed each other regularly, exchanging nods, occasionally walking together for a circuit or two before naturally separating again. There was no awkwardness in these mergings and separations. They happened with the fluidity of water finding its course, each man following his own rhythm while remaining part of the collective movement. On one circuit, Oswald found himself beside Brother Aelred, who was 23 years old and still adjusting to monastic life's demands. The young man's face held that mixture of earnestness and uncertainty that came with new commitment. "Brother Oswald," Aelred said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," Oswald replied, his tone encouraging. "How do you maintain such steadiness? I watch you at your work and you seem always content, always certain of your path. I find myself doubting, questioning whether I truly belong here." Oswald was quiet for several steps, considering his response carefully. "Doubt is not the enemy," he said finally. "Even after 21 years in this place, I sometimes wonder about the path not taken. But I have learned that steadiness does not mean the absence of uncertainty. It means continuing to put one foot before the other, doing the day's work, saying the day's prayers, trusting that the path reveals itself through the walking of it." "But how do you know if you're walking the right path?" Aelred pressed. "You don't always know," Oswald admitted. "Not with certainty, but you attend to how it feels, whether the work brings peace more often than agitation, whether life draws you closer to or further from what you sense God asks of you. For me, the ice house and the marsh, the tools and the offices, the brothers and the silence, these feel right in my bones. But your path may be different, and that is as it should be." Aelred walked in silence, absorbing this. "Thank you," he said after a while. "It helps to know that even those who seem certain still carry questions." They completed another circuit together, then naturally separated as each found his own pace again. Oswald felt the familiar satisfaction that came from helping a younger brother, from passing on whatever small wisdom he had accumulated. This, too, was part of the monastery's life, the generations teaching and learning from each other, knowledge flowing both ways across the years. The bell for Vespers rang, calling them all toward the church. The evening office proceeded with its ancient dignity, the psalms rising and falling, the prayers spoken in unison. Light was fading from the windows now, and the candles seemed brighter in compensation, their flames creating a warm glow that softened all the sharp edges of stone and wood. When Vespers concluded, the community moved to the refectory for the evening meal. Oswald found himself particularly hungry this evening, perhaps because of the cold or the accumulation of several days' labor. The bread tasted exceptionally good, the cheese sharp and satisfying, and even the weak ale seemed to carry more flavor than usual. After the meal, during the brief period before complying, Oswald made one final check of the ice house. It had become his habit on these winter evenings, a last verification before the night's rest. He lit a candle and descended the steps, noting with satisfaction how the stored ice had grown over the past days. The house was perhaps a third full now, with many more harvests still to come before winter released its grip. Standing in the cold chamber, Oswald found himself reflecting on time's passage. This ice, frozen now, solid and clear, would melt eventually, returning to water, fulfilling its purpose of preservation and cooling before disappearing back into the cycle. Nothing was permanent except the cycle itself, the endless turning of seasons and days. Yet there was comfort in that impermanence. The ice he stored this winter would be different ice than he stored next winter, just as the prayers he said today were both the same and different from the prayers he had said yesterday. Each moment unique, each moment part of an eternal pattern. He climbed back to the surface and secured the door. The night had fully arrived now, stars brilliant overhead in the clear sky. The temperature had dropped sharply with the sunset, and Oswald could feel frost beginning to form on every surface. His breath froze in his beard, creating tiny crystals that caught the starlight. The bell for Compline rang, and he made his way to the church for the final office. The service was brief as always, the words familiar and soothing, preparing the community for sleep. When it ended, the great silence descended, and the brothers moved through the darkness to the dormitory. Oswald prepared for bed with his usual care, then settled beneath the wool blankets. His body was pleasantly tired, ready for rest. Around him, the other brothers were making their own preparations, the soft sounds creating a gentle accompaniment to the approaching sleep. He lay in the darkness, feeling the day settle into memory. Good work done, community maintained, prayers offered. The deep contentment that was his emotional baseline washed over him once more, not excitement or joy exactly, but rather a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Sleep came like a gentle tide, drawing him down into its depths. The night held him, and the monastery around him, and the land around the monastery, all nested within the larger darkness like a series of protective shells. Oswald released his hold on waking consciousness and let sleep carry him where it would. The rhythm of days continued, each one following the pattern established over generations, each one unique in its small details while remaining part of the eternal whole. Oswald woke to the bell for lauds, rose in the darkness, joined his brothers in prayer, and began another day's work with the same patient attention he brought to all things. This particular morning, as he made his way to the marsh after breakfast and terrace, he noticed that the quality of the ice had changed slightly. The night's cold had been especially intense, and the pond's surface showed new formations, delicate frost flowers that had grown where moisture met the frozen surface, creating structures like miniature gardens of crystalline blooms. Oswald knelt at the pond's edge, his weathered hands supporting his weight, and examined these formations with the attention they deserved. They were fragile, temporary, already beginning to collapse under their own weight and the day's slight warming. Yet they possessed a beauty that took his breath away, intricate patterns formed by nothing more than water and cold and time, each one unique, each one perfect in its brief existence. He remained there for several minutes, simply observing. This was another gift of his work, these moments of unexpected wonder that appeared when he was quiet enough to notice them. The frost flowers would be gone within the hour, melted and forgotten, but for now they existed, and he was present to witness them. Eventually, the practical demands of his task reasserted themselves. Oswald rose and took up his hook, beginning the familiar work of breaking and extracting ice. The frost flowers disappeared under the first strike, but their image remained in his mind, a small treasure to carry through the day. The harvest went smoothly. He loaded 6 substantial pieces onto the sledge, each one clear and solid. As he worked, clouds began to build in the western sky, suggesting weather changes to come. Oswald noted this with the part of his awareness that always tracked such patterns, but felt no concern. The monastery was well provisioned for winter's variations, and his work had created a good reserve of stored ice. On the return journey, he encountered Brother Martin, who who served as the monastery's provisioner, responsible for acquiring supplies the community could not produce itself. Martin was 49 years old, with the lean build of someone who walked many miles in the course of his duties. He carried a staff and a leather pack, clearly preparing for a journey. "Going to the market town?" Oswald asked, pausing with his sledge. "Yes," Martin confirmed. "We need salt, and there are some tools Brother Reinhard requires that we cannot forge ourselves. I should return by tomorrow evening if the weather holds." They both glanced at the building clouds. "It may snow," Oswald observed. "Not today perhaps, but soon." "I will make haste then," Martin said, "though haste on winter roads is relative." He smiled slightly. "God willing, the way will be passable." "Travel safely," Oswald said, and Martin nodded his thanks before continuing toward the monastery gate. Oswald watched him go for a moment, grateful as always for those brothers whose work took them beyond the monastery walls, maintaining connections with the wider world. His own labor kept him mostly within the grounds, but Martin's journeys brought back not just supplies but news and perspective, reminders that the monastery existed within a larger human community. At the ice house, he performed his usual work of storing the harvest. The chamber was noticeably fuller now, perhaps half its capacity used. At this rate, another week of good cold weather would see it adequately stocked for the coming year. The thought brought satisfaction, the knowledge that his stewardship was bearing fruit. After storing the ice, Oswald found himself with an unusual span of free time before sext. The morning's work had gone efficiently, and there were no immediate tasks demanding attention. He considered his options. The workshop always had some tool that could benefit from maintenance. The cloister offered its walking meditation, the library its quiet contemplation. Instead, he found himself drawn to the church, not for any scheduled office, but simply to sit in its presence. He entered through the heavy wooden door, stepping from the pale morning light into the dimmer interior. The space was empty of other people, though never truly empty. The accumulated prayers of centuries seemed to saturate the very stones. Oswald made his way to the same small side chapel where he often spent time in private prayer. He lowered himself onto the stone floor, feeling the cold seep through his wool clothing, and settled into stillness. His weathered hands rested loosely in his lap, and he let his breathing slow and deepen. He formed no specific prayers in words. Instead, he simply sat in openness, attending to the silence that surrounded him. Occasionally, a thought would surface, a memory of the morning's frost flowers, a consideration of tomorrow's work, a fragment of plainchant melody, and he would acknowledge it and let it pass, returning to the simple presence of sitting, breathing, being. Time lost its usual markers in this state. Oswald had no sense of whether he sat for 10 minutes or an hour. The external world faded to a distant awareness while his attention turned inward, not to his own thoughts exactly, but to something deeper, a stillness beneath thought, a place where the constant activity of the mind quieted into something more fundamental. The bell for sext eventually called him back. Oswald rose slowly, his knees protesting the long contact with cold stone, and made his way to his place in the choir. The service unfolded as it always did, but he found himself particularly aware of the words this time, as though the period of silent sitting had sensitized him to their meaning. After sext, the community gathered for dinner. The meal was heartier than usual. Brother Aldric had made a pottage with dried fish added to the usual vegetables and peas, creating a richer flavor. There was also fresh bread, still warm from the morning's baking, and a small portion of preserved fruit for each brother. As Oswald ate, he noticed Brother Aelred, the young novice he had spoken with the day before. The younger man caught his eye and offered a slight smile, a gesture of thanks for the counsel given. Oswald returned the smile with a small nod. These wordless exchanges, brief acknowledgments of connection and care, were part of the monastery's subtle language of community. After dinner came the period of rest, and Oswald decided to spend it in the warming room. This chamber, one of the few places where conversation was freely permitted and a fire burned throughout the day, served as the community's informal gathering space. When he entered, he found several brothers already there, seated on benches arranged around the hearth. Brother Godwin sat near the fire, his ink-stained fingers wrapped around a wooden cup of warm ale. Brother Thomas reclined with his back against the wall, clearly favoring his troublesome spine. Old Brother Cuthbert, who at 72 was the community's eldest member, dozed lightly in the corner, his breathing peaceful and regular. Oswald settled onto an empty bench and accepted a cup of warm ale from the novice who tended the fire. The heat from the hearth felt wonderful after the morning's cold work, and he stretched his legs toward it gratefully. "I saw the clouds building," Godwin said, continuing what was apparently an ongoing conversation. "We may have snow by evening." "Martin left for the market town this morning," Oswald added. "I hope he has a good time before the weather turns." "Martin knows the roads well," Thomas said. "He will gauge it properly." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the fire crackling, the warmth seeping into their bones. Old Brother Cuthbert stirred and opened his eyes, looking around with that moment of disorientation that comes from waking in an unexpected place. "Ah," he said, focusing on the others. "I was dreaming of spring. Strange to dream of warmth while sitting beside a fire." "What was it like your dream?" Godwin asked with genuine interest. Cuthbert considered his weathered face thoughtful. "I was walking through the meadow beyond the marsh, and everything was in bloom. Not just the common flowers, but things I have not seen in years, flowers from my childhood in the south. The air was full of scent and birdsong, and I felt young again, without the aches that wake me now each morning." "A gift," Oswald said quietly, "to visit spring while winter holds the land." "Yes," Cuthbert agreed, though waking back to winter was harder for the visiting. He smiled slightly. "But I am grateful for both the dream and the waking. Each has its purpose." The conversation drifted after that, moving from topic to topic in the unhurried way of men who had time and no pressure to use it for any particular purpose. They spoke of the herb garden's spring planting, of repairs needed to one of the outbuildings, of a traveling friar who had passed through the week before with news from other monasteries. Oswald mostly listened, adding occasional observations, but content to let the others carry the conversation. He found he was thinking about Cuthbert's dream, about the way memory and longing could create such vivid experiences. He himself rarely dreamed, or at least rarely remembered his dreams, but he understood the pull toward spring even in winter's depths, that knowledge that the cycle would turn, that warmth and growth would return. The bell for none eventually called them from the warming room's comfort. They made their way to the church, joining the other brothers for the brief afternoon office. When it concluded, Oswald returned to his work. There were no more ice harvests needed today, but there was always maintenance, checking the ice house's ventilation, ensuring the door's hinges remained sound, verifying that the stored ice remained properly covered with straw. He moved through these tasks with his characteristic thoroughness, attending to details that might seem minor but which accumulated into reliable function over time. A hinge bolt tightened here, a few handfuls of fresh straw added there, a careful inspection of the walls for any signs of moisture or settling, small actions that maintained the integrity of the whole. As he worked, the predicted weather change began. The clouds that had been building all day finally reached overhead, and the light took on that peculiar flat quality that precedes snow. The temperature held steady, cold but not bitter, perfect for the soft snow that would fall rather than the hard pellets of sleet. Oswald was securing the ice house door when the first flakes began. They fell slowly, almost tentatively at first, individual specks of white drifting down from the gray sky. He paused to watch them, holding out one weathered hand to catch a few flakes. They landed on his palm, tiny perfect crystals that melted almost immediately from his body's warmth. The snow increased gradually, thickening until the air seemed full of white movement. It fell without wind, dropping straight down, beginning to accumulate on the ground in a thin layer. Oswald stood in it for several minutes, his face turned upward, feeling the soft, cold touches on his skin, watching the monastery grounds transform under the gathering white. There was something purifying about fresh snow, he thought. It covered all the worn paths and weathered surfaces, creating a sense of renewal, of beginning again. By morning, the world would look different, simplified, gentled, made new by this soft white blanket. Eventually, the cold penetrated even his appreciation, and he made his way toward the shelter of the cloister. Other brothers had gathered there, standing in the covered walkway and watching the snow fall across the ground. They stood in small groups or alone, but all shared the same quiet attention to the weather's gift. Brother Godwin stood near one of the columns, and Oswald joined him. They watched together in silence for a time before Godwin spoke. "The bees will be glad of this," he said. "Snow insulates better than empty air. They will be warmer tonight than they were last night, despite the falling temperature." "Nature's provision," Oswald observed. "Everything serves multiple purposes if we attend carefully enough to see them." "Yes," Godwin agreed. "The ice you store cools our provisions. The snow that falls insulates the bees and protects the dormant plants and will melt in spring to water the new growth. Nothing is wasted, nothing without purpose." They continued watching as the snow accumulated, covering the garth, the roofs, the pathways. The world grew quieter as the snow muffled sound, creating that particular hush that comes with snowfall. Even the usual distant noises, wind in the eaves, the occasional bird call, faded into silence. The bell for Vespers rang, softer than usual, its sound absorbed by the falling snow. The brothers made their way to the church, their footsteps leaving the first tracks in the fresh white covering. Inside, the candles seemed to burn brighter against the darkness that came earlier now that the sky was obscured by clouds and snow. The evening office proceeded with its usual rhythm, but Oswald found himself particularly aware of the psalms that spoke of winter and protection, of shelter and trust. The words seemed to resonate with the snow falling outside, creating a harmony between inner prayer and outer reality. When Vespers concluded, the community moved to the refectory for the evening meal. Looking through the windows, Oswald could see that the snow had accumulated perhaps 2 inches already and showed no signs of stopping. The monastery grounds had been transformed into a landscape of soft white curves and shadows, beautiful in its simplicity. The meal was simple but warming, bread and cheese, some dried apples stewed with honey, and warm ale. Brother Aldric had also made a porridge from oats and milk, thick and satisfying, perfect for a snowy evening. The brothers ate with a good appetite, grateful for the warmth and nourishment. After the meal, Oswald felt drawn outside one more time before Compline. He stepped into the snow, which now reached nearly to his ankles, and walked to a point where he could see across the monastery grounds. Everything had been simplified by the white covering, all the small imperfections and wear marks hidden, all the colors reduced to shades of white and gray, the whole world rendered in its most essential forms. He stood there as snow continued to fall, accumulating on his shoulders and hood, melting where it touched his face. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of flakes settling onto existing snow. No wind, no bird calls, no distant sounds of human activity, just the gentle, continuous fall of white from gray sky. Oswald felt something settle in his chest, a deep peace that had nothing to do with circumstances or achievements, but simply with being present in this moment, in this place, under this snow. His weathered hands hung at his sides, and he made no movement, simply standing, breathing, existing as one element among many in this quiet evening landscape. The bell for complaint eventually called him back. He shook the snow from his cloak and joined the others in the church for the day's final office. The words spoke of rest and protection, of trust through the night, of the promise that morning would come. The brothers' voices rose together, a human sound in the snow-hushed world, an affirmation of faith and community. When the service ended and the great silence began, Oswald made his way through the snow to the dormitory. His bed waited, and sleep would come easily after another day of good work. But first he paused at one of the narrow windows, looking out at the snow still falling through the darkness, visible only where it passed through the faint light from the dormitory's few candles. He stood there for a long moment, then turned and made his way to his bed. He removed his outer garments, now damp from the snow, and laid them where they would dry. He settled beneath the wool blankets, feeling their familiar weight and warmth. Around him, the other brothers were making their own preparations, the soft sounds creating a gentle accompaniment to the night's beginning. Oswald lay in the darkness, listening to the profound silence that the snow created. His body was tired but content, ready for rest. His mind drifted over the day's events, the frost flowers at dawn, the conversation with Martin, the time in the church, the dream that Brother Cuthbert had shared, the snow transforming the world outside. All of it part of the pattern, he thought. All of it woven together into the fabric of a life lived in prayer and work, in community and solitude, in the rhythm of seasons and services. He felt deeply grateful for this life, for these brothers, for this place that had become his home. Sleep came gently, drawing him down into its embrace. Outside, the snow continued to fall through the darkness, covering the monastery and the marsh and the fields beyond in a blanket of white. Inside, the community rested, held safe within stone walls, within the rhythm of their shared life, within the larger rhythms of earth and season, and the turning of days into nights and back into days again. Morning arrived transformed. Oswald woke to the bell for lauds and rose in darkness as always. But when the brothers emerged from the dormitory after the dawn office, they stepped into a world remade. The snow had fallen through most of the night, accumulating to perhaps 6 inches, and now lay pristine and undisturbed across every surface. The sky had cleared during the final hours before dawn, and now stars still visible in the west competed with the first pale light appearing in the east. The snow reflected what little light existed, creating a luminosity that seemed to come from the ground itself. Everything glowed softly: the paths, the roofs, the walls where snow had drifted against them. Oswald stood for a moment outside the dormitory, simply breathing the cold air and taking in the transformed landscape. The familiar monastery grounds had become strange and new, all the usual markers obscured or altered by the snow's blanket. Yet underneath, he knew, everything remained the same. The paths still led where they had always led. The buildings stood in their accustomed places. The routines would unfold as they always did. After breakfast and prime, he made his way to the ice house. The walk required more effort now, each step breaking through the snow's crust, but the path was direct enough that navigation presented no difficulty. At the ice house, he brushed snow from the door and checked its condition. Everything remained sound. The overnight cold had been intense, but the structure's design protected it well. He decided not to venture to the marsh for harvesting today. The walk would be difficult through the snow, and more importantly, the ponds would need time for their surfaces to stabilize after the snowfall. Fresh snow would have insulated the ice, possibly causing some surface melting where the two met, and it was better to wait a day or two before resuming harvest. Instead, Oswald turned his attention to other tasks. The monastery's pathways needed clearing, at least the main routes between essential buildings. He collected a wooden shovel from the tool shed and began the work of pushing snow aside, creating clear lanes for his brothers to walk. The work was harder than ice harvesting in some ways, requiring different muscles, demanding sustained pushing rather than the varied movements of cutting and carrying. But it had its own satisfaction. Behind him, a clear path appeared where snow had been. Before him, an unmarked white waited to be cleared. The progress was visible and immediate. He worked steadily, moving from the dormitory to the church, then from the church to the refectory, creating a network of cleared paths. Other brothers joined the effort. Brother Thomas, despite his back, young Brother Aelred with the energy of youth, Brother Godwin taking breaks from his own concerns to help. They worked mostly in silence, the great silence having ended after prime, but the work itself creating a meditative quality that discouraged conversation. By the time the bell rang for terce, the main pathways were clear, snow piled in neat banks on either side. The brothers gathered in the church, their faces reddened from cold and exertion, their breath still coming quickly. The office proceeded as always, but there was an additional sense of community warmth, the shared labor creating bonds that words could not. After terce, Oswald found himself with Brother Aldric in the kitchen. The kitchen master was preparing dough for bread, his flour-dusted hands working the mass with practiced efficiency. "The cold storage is serving well," Aldric said as Oswald entered. "The fish I stored 3 days ago remains fresh, and the butter shows no signs of turning. Your ice keeps getting steadily cold even in this weather." "The snow helps," Oswald observed. "It insulates the ice house further, keeping the cold locked in." "Everything serves its purpose," Aldric said with his characteristic slight smile. He shaped a portion of dough and set it aside to rise. "I was thinking, when spring comes and we have fresh milk again, we might try making more butter than usual, storing it in your ice house through summer. The visiting brothers always appreciate good butter, and we could offer more generous portions if we knew it would keep. The ice should last well into autumn if we continue the harvest through the next weeks," Oswald confirmed. "We could easily dedicate a section to butter storage." They discussed the practicalities for a few moments, how the butter should be wrapped, how often it would need checking, and the best arrangement within the ice house. It was the kind of planning conversation that happened regularly among the brothers, each one's work intersecting with others, creating efficiencies and improvements through collaboration. Oswald accepted a cup of warm ale and a piece of bread from Aldric, then made his way to the warming room. Several brothers had gathered there after the morning's snow clearing, grateful for the fire's heat. He settled onto a bench and stretched his legs toward the flames, feeling the pleasant ache in his muscles from the shoveling work. Brother Cuthbert was there again, looking more alert today than he had the day before. The old brother's face held color, and his eyes were bright with interest as he listened to Brother Benedict describe a manuscript that had arrived the previous week from another monastery. "It contains commentaries on the Psalms I have not encountered before," Benedict was saying, his scholar's enthusiasm evident despite his usual quiet demeanor. "The scribe's hand is exceptional, very clear, well-proportioned letters, a pleasure to read even beyond the content. Will you copy it for our own library?" Thomas asked from his position against the wall. "Perhaps portions of it," Benedict said. "The complete work would take months, and we have other copying priorities, but certain passages deserve preservation in our collection." The conversation drifted to other topics, the snow's effect on various aspects of monastery life, speculation about when Brother Martin might return from his journey to the market town, discussion of repairs that would be needed once spring arrived. Oswald listened more than he spoke, content to be part of the gathering without needing to direct or dominate it. At one point, young Brother Aelred entered, his face still flushed from continued work outside. He had taken it upon himself to clear additional paths, including one to the woodshed and another to the livestock buildings, where the monastery's few animals were housed. "The sheep are well," Aelred reported to no one in particular. "I checked on them after clearing the path. They seemed content enough with their hay and shelter." "Good work," Brother Thomas said with approval. "The animals need tending regardless of weather." Aelred accepted the acknowledgement with a pleased expression and settled near the fire to warm himself. Oswald noted how the young man had thrown himself into the physical labor, perhaps finding in it a clarity that the more contemplative aspects of monastic life did not yet provide. Everyone found their own path to peace, he thought, and for some, that path led through the body's work before reaching the spirit's rest. The bell for sext rang, calling them to midday prayer. The community gathered in the church, and the office unfolded with its timeless rhythm. Afterward came dinner, which Brother Aldric had made especially hearty, a thick pottage with vegetables and some preserved meat, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and even a small portion of honey mixed with ground nuts as a rare treat. The meal restored energy depleted by the morning's work, and Oswald found himself feeling particularly satisfied as he finished his portion. Around him, the other brothers ate with similar appreciation, the shared labor of the morning having sharpened appetites. After dinner came the rest period, but Oswald felt too restless to sit idle. He decided to check on the ice house once more, a verification that was probably unnecessary but which would settle his mind. He made his way through the cleared paths, noting how the afternoon sun had begun to create melting at the edges where snow met cleared stone. At the ice house, everything remained as it should be. He descended the steps with a lit candle and examined the stored ice, finding it solid and well preserved. The cold in the chamber was intense, seeming even deeper than usual. Perhaps the snow's insulation was indeed having an effect, holding the cold more securely within the earth's embrace. Oswald stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the fruits of his recent labor. The ice stacks rose on either side, separated by their layers of straw, each piece representing a journey to the marsh, a careful extraction, a mindful storage. Looking at it all, he felt a deep satisfaction. This was good work, honest work, work that served the community's needs in concrete and measurable ways. He climbed back to the surface and secured the door, then stood for a moment looking out across the snow-covered grounds. The sun had fully emerged now, and the snow sparkled with almost painful brightness. The sky had achieved that deep blue clarity of winter, and a few small birds moved among the bare branches of the orchard trees, their dark shapes vivid against the white. A movement caught his eye, Brother Martin approaching from the direction of the gate, his staff in hand, his pack looking heavier than when he had departed. The provisioner had made good time, returning a day earlier than expected. Oswald walked to meet him, curious about the journey. "You traveled through the snow?" Oswald asked as they met. "The worst of it missed the road," Martin replied. His face was weathered from the journey, but his expression was satisfied. I could see the clouds building and pushed hard to reach the town before the fall began. Spent the night in the guest house there, then returned this morning when the road was still passable. A successful journey. Very, Martin confirmed. I acquired the salt we needed and Brother Reinhard's tools, and the merchant had word from the bishop's household. They may send a visitation in spring, nothing concerning, simply the regular inspection. They walked together toward the main buildings, Martin's footsteps showing slight stiffness from the long walk. The world beyond these walls continues its turns, Martin observed. Markets and merchants, news and rumors. Sometimes I am glad to return to our quiet rhythms. Yet your work keeps us connected, Oswald said. We would be too isolated without those who venture beyond. True enough, Martin agreed. Balance in all things, withdrawal and engagement, silence and speech, solitude and community. They reached the dormitory, where Martin would leave his pack before reporting to the abbot about his journey. Oswald left him there and made his way to the workshop, where he had planned to spend the afternoon maintaining tools. The workshop was empty when he arrived, and he appreciated the solitude. He selected several tools that needed attention. His ice hook required cleaning. The sledge's rope could benefit from treatment with oil to keep it supple. Various smaller implements needed sharpening or adjustment. He settled at the workbench and began the meditative work of maintenance. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, knowing without conscious thought how much pressure to apply, what angle to hold the blade against the whetstone, how to test the integrity of a rope's fibers. The work was deeply familiar, almost automatic, allowing his mind to drift while his hands continued their skilled labor. He found himself thinking about time, how it moved in these slow winter days, marked by bells and offices, measured by accumulated snow and stored ice. Time here felt different than he imagined it must in the world beyond the monastery walls, where he supposed people rushed and worried and planned with urgency. Here, time was simply what it was, a river that carried everything forward at its own pace, neither hurried nor delayed. Brother Reinhard entered the workshop after a while, immediately going to examine the new tools that Martin had acquired. He unwrapped them with care, examining each piece with the critical eye of a master craftsman. "Good steel," he pronounced, testing one of the files against his thumbnail. "The merchant knows quality. These will serve many years." Oswald continued his own work while Reinhard organized his new acquisitions. The presence of another person in the workshop changed its quality somehow. Not worse, not better, simply different. The shared space of craft, two men attending to their work while aware of each other's presence, created its own form of companionship. They worked in silence for a long span, the only sounds the scrape of metal on stone, the soft clinking of tools being arranged, the occasional shift of weight or adjustment of position. Outside, the afternoon light began its slow decline toward evening, the sun's angle lowering, shadows lengthening across the snow. Eventually Reinhard spoke. "Your ice hook, it serves well." "Very well," Oswald confirmed as he had before. "The balance remains perfect." "Good," Reinhard said with satisfaction. When I forge a tool, I think about the hands that will hold it, the work it will perform, the seasons it will pass through. A tool is not just metal and wood. It is a partnership between maker and user. Then we are well partnered, Oswald said. Your craft and mine work together toward a common purpose. Reinhard nodded, accepting this acknowledgement. They returned to their separate tasks, but something had been exchanged, a recognition of mutual respect, an appreciation of how different skills combine to serve the community's needs. The bell for none rang, calling them from the workshop to the church. The brief afternoon office passed quickly, and then the day moved into its evening phase. Oswald made his rounds, checking the ice house one final time, ensuring tools were properly stored, verifying that the cleared paths remained passable as melting and refreezing created new hazards. As he walked, he noticed how the snow had transformed throughout the day. What had been pristine and uniform in the morning now showed the marks of monastery life, footprints crossing in various directions, areas where snow had been cleared or had melted, places where it remained deep and undisturbed. The day's living had been written onto the white surface, a temporary record that the next snowfall would erase. The evening proceeded according to its established rhythm. Vespers in the gathering darkness, the candles seeming especially warm against the cold that pressed in from outside. The evening meal, simple but nourishing. The brief period of free time, which Oswald spent in quiet conversation with Brother Godwin about the coming spring's garden plans. Before complying, Oswald stepped outside one final time. The night was clear and intensely cold, the kind of cold that made the inside of his nose freeze with each breath. Stars blazed overhead in impossible numbers, the Milky Way a bright river flowing across the sky. The snow reflected their light, creating a landscape that seemed to glow from within. He stood in this cold beauty, his breath forming clouds that rose and dissipated. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, perhaps a return to ice harvesting if the marsh had settled, perhaps more snow clearing if another storm came, perhaps some task not yet anticipated. Whatever came, he would meet it with the same patient attention, the same steady labor, the same trust in the rhythm that held everything. The bell for Compline rang, its sound carrying clearly through the cold air. Oswald made his way to the church for the day's final office, joining his brothers for the prayers that would send them into sleep. The familiar words rose into the darkness, speaking of protection and trust, of rest and renewal, of the promise that morning would come as it always did. When the service ended and the great silence began, Oswald walked through the snow to the dormitory. His bed waited, and sleep would come easily after another day lived fully. He prepared for rest with his usual care, then settled beneath the wool blankets. Around him, the other brothers were doing the same, creating the soft sounds of a community settling into night. Outside, the cold deepened and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Inside, warmth and shelter and the company of brothers. Oswald felt his body relax into the mattress, felt his breathing slow and deepen, felt consciousness beginning to loosen its grip. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of ice, patient and enduring in the house's depths, holding winter's gift for the seasons yet to come. Then even that thought released, and there was only darkness and rest and the peaceful descent into sleep. The days that followed settled into a comfortable pattern, each one a variation on familiar themes. The snow remained, though it compacted under its own weight and the occasional touch of weak winter sun. Oswald returned to ice harvesting when the marsh had stabilized, finding the work perhaps slightly harder with snow to navigate but no less satisfying. Each morning began the same way, the bell for lauds pulling him from sleep, the gathering in darkness for prayer, the slow arrival of light revealing the monastery grounds in their winter dress. After breakfast and the morning offices, he would make his way to the marsh, his boots crunching through the snow's crust, his breath visible in the cold air. The ponds had developed interesting characteristics under the snow. Where the white covering had insulated the surface, the ice beneath had sometimes thinned slightly. But in other places, especially where wind had swept the snow away before it could accumulate, the ice had thickened beautifully. Oswald learned to read these variations, choosing his harvest locations with increasing precision. One morning, as he worked at the pond's edge, a deer appeared at the tree line, a doe, her winter coat thick and gray-brown, her ears alert and swiveling. She watched Oswald for a long moment, assessing him, then apparently deciding he posed no threat. She stepped delicately into the open. She moved to a patch where snow had been blown thin and began pawing at it, searching for whatever dried grass might be accessible beneath. Oswald remained still, not wanting to startle her. His weathered hands held the ice hook loosely, and he simply observed as the doe continued her foraging. She found something to her liking and ate unhurriedly, her jaw working sideways in that characteristic motion of deer. Occasionally, she would raise her head to check her surroundings, but she seemed comfortable enough with Oswald's presence. They shared the space for perhaps 10 minutes before the doe finished her meal and moved back toward the tree line. She paused at the edge to look back once, then disappeared among the willows. Oswald felt grateful for the encounter. These meetings with the wild creatures who also called this landscape home were gifts that required nothing beyond the presence and patience to receive them. He returned to his work with renewed contentment, cutting and loading ice with the same steady rhythm. The sledge filled gradually, and when it held a good load, he began the return journey. The path through the snow had become more defined with repeated use, making the walk easier than those first days after the snowfall. Back at the monastery, life continued its orderly progression. Brother Aldric baked his bread and prepared his meals. Brother Godwin tended to winter tasks in the garden shed, repairing tools and planning spring sowings. Brother Reinhard worked his forge when the cold was not too intense, the heat from his fire a welcome beacon in the workshop. Brother Benedict continued his patient work in the library, cataloging and occasionally copying precious texts. Young Brother Aelred seemed to be settling more comfortably into the rhythm of monastic life. Oswald noticed how the young man's initial restlessness had given way to something more grounded. He still carried questions. That much was evident in his occasional thoughtful expressions. But the questions seemed less urgent, more like companions to walk with rather than problems demanding immediate resolution. One afternoon, after none, Oswald found himself walking the cloister alongside Aelred. They paced in companionable silence for 2 circuits before the younger man spoke. "I have been thinking about what you said," Aelred began. "About steadiness not meaning the absence of uncertainty, but continuing despite it." "Yes," Oswald encouraged. "I think I understand better now," Aelred continued. "The work helps, having tasks that need doing, routines that repeat. My hands know what to do even when my mind is uncertain. And somehow, the doing settles the uncertainty, or at least makes it less troubling." "That is wisdom," Oswald said with quiet approval. "The body often understands what the mind still puzzles over. Trust your hands, trust the work, and the rest will clarify in its own time." They completed another circuit in silence, then Aelred spoke again. "Thank you, Brother Oswald, for the patience with my questions." "We all carried questions when we were new," Oswald replied. "And truth be told, we carry them still. They simply change their nature with time." The younger man smiled at that and seemed to relax further. They parted naturally as their paths diverged, and Oswald continued his walking alone. He felt pleased by the exchange, not proud exactly, but satisfied that he had offered something useful to a brother who needed it. This too was part of monastic life, the older teaching the younger, the experienced supporting the novice, generation passing wisdom to generation. The week progressed through its established rhythm. Ice was harvested and stored until the ice house was perhaps 3/4 full, an excellent reserve that would serve well into the following autumn if properly managed. The community gathered for its 8 daily offices, marking time's passage with prayer and psalm. Meals were taken together, work was accomplished, rest was found in appropriate measure. Brother Martin, fully recovered from his journey, had settled back into his usual routines. He spent his days organizing the supplies he had acquired, ensuring proper storage, and maintaining the accounts that tracked the monastery's provisions. When Oswald encountered him in the cloister one evening, Martin shared news he had heard during his town visit. "The winter has been hard throughout the region," Martin reported. "Harder than most in recent memory. The market town stores are running lower than usual, and they expect difficulties if spring comes late." "Are we well provided?" Oswald asked. "Very well," Martin confirmed. "Our preparations were thorough, and we have reserves sufficient for several more months if needed. But I thought it worth mentioning. We may see travelers seeking shelter or assistance as the winter wears on." "The guest house is ready." "Always," Martin said. "Part of our purpose is hospitality. We serve God through serving those who come to our door." This conversation stayed with Oswald as he continued his evening walk. The monastery existed not in isolation, but as part of a larger human community, and its relative comfort carried responsibilities. The ice he stored, the food the brothers prepared, the shelter their buildings provided, all of these could be shared when need arose. Hospitality was not merely politeness, but a sacred duty, rooted in the understanding that every stranger might be Christ in disguise. The evening proceeded toward Compline with its usual quiet grace. Oswald attended Vespers, took his simple evening meal, spent the period before the final office in contemplative walking. The snow under the night sky had taken on that blue quality it sometimes possessed, neither quite white nor quite gray, but something between, luminous and mysterious. During Compline, as the community spoke the final prayers of the day, Oswald found his attention drawn to a particular phrase. "May the all-powerful Lord grant us a restful night and a peaceful death." The words had been spoken countless times, but tonight they seemed to carry particular weight. A restful night, a peaceful death, the two linked, both forms of surrender, both requiring trust in something beyond immediate control. He thought about this as he prepared for sleep, as he settled beneath his wool blankets, as he felt consciousness beginning to dissolve into rest. Every night was a small death, he thought, a release of the day's concerns, a surrender to unconsciousness, a trust that morning would come. And if one could learn this nightly surrender, perhaps the final surrender would come more easily when its time arrived. But these thoughts were too large for the edge of sleep. They drifted away like smoke, and Oswald let them go. His weathered hands rested on his chest, his breathing slowed and deepened, and sleep came to gather him in. The night passed in its usual way, dark and cold outside, warm enough beneath the blankets, the community at rest within the shelter of stone walls. At some unmarked hour, new snow began to fall, adding another layer to what already lay upon the ground. It fell silently through the darkness, accumulating on roofs and walls and bare branches, writing its own quiet story upon the sleeping world. Morning came with the bell for lauds, and Oswald rose into another day. The snow that had fallen during the night was lighter this time, perhaps only an inch, but it renewed the landscape's pristine quality. The paths would need clearing again, and he would help with that after the morning offices and breakfast. Then, if the cold held steady, another journey to the marsh for ice harvesting. The day unfolded according to its established rhythms. Prayers were said, meals were eaten, work was accomplished. Oswald moved through it all with his characteristic patient attention, present to each task, mindful of each moment, trusting the pattern that held everything. In the afternoon, after none, he found himself once more in the library. The room was quiet and dim, illuminated by the pale light that filtered through narrow windows. Brother Benedict was at his desk as usual, working on some cataloging project, his pen scratching softly against parchment. Oswald selected a different book this time, not the Psalter but a collection of writings by the Desert Fathers, those early monks who had lived in the Egyptian wilderness centuries before. He opened it carefully and began to read, following the Latin slowly, pausing over phrases that seemed to hold particular wisdom. One passage caught his attention. "Abide in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." He sat with these words for a long time, considering their meaning. The cell, the simple room where a monk lived, was not just physical space but also interior space, the self with all its thoughts and feelings and uncertainties. To abide there, to remain present with what was rather than fleeing into distraction or fantasy, was perhaps the deepest work. His own cell was not a private room but his bed in the dormitory, his place in the choir, his work with the ice house and the marsh. Yet the principle seemed the same, to remain faithful to his particular circumstances, to work with what was actually present rather than wishing for something different. In this abiding, this patient presence, everything necessary would be revealed. He closed the book eventually and returned it to its shelf. Brother Benedict looked up and offered a slight nod, and Oswald returned it. No words were needed. They understood each other as men who had both found their way to this life of prayer and work, each following their own path to the same destination. The afternoon moved toward evening. Oswald checked the ice house one final time, finding everything sound and well preserved, then made his way to the church for Vespers. The community gathered as always, their voices rising together in the ancient psalms. Outside, the winter day faded into winter night, the cycle completing once more. After the evening meal, Oswald found himself drawn to the church again during the free period before complying. He entered the dim space and made his way to his usual chapel. But instead of kneeling, he simply sat on the stone floor, his back against the cold wall, his weathered hands resting in his lap. He sat in the darkness and the silence, not praying in words but simply being present. Thoughts came and went, memories of the day, anticipations of tomorrow, fragments of psalms and conversations, and he let them all pass without grasping. Beneath the thoughts, there was simply sitting, simply breathing, simply being alive in this moment, in this place. Time passed without measure. The stone was cold against his back, the air was cold in his lungs, but these sensations were simply what was, requiring no response beyond acknowledgement. He sat, and the darkness held him, and somewhere deep within, a stillness that had no name deepened and expanded. The bell for complaint eventually called him back. Oswald rose slowly, feeling his knees protest, feeling the cold that had settled into his bones. He made his way to his place in the choir and added his voice to the final prayers. The words spoke of protection and rest, of trust through the night, of the eternal presence that held all things. When the service ended and the great silence began, he walked through the cold darkness to the dormitory. His body was tired, ready for sleep. He prepared for bed with his usual care, folding his garments, settling beneath the blankets, finding his comfortable position. Around him, his brothers were doing the same, creating the soft sounds of a community preparing for rest. Oswald lay in the darkness, feeling sleep approaching. His mind was quiet now, settled by the day's work and the evening's sitting. His weathered hands rested on his chest, and his breathing slowed naturally, deepening into the rhythm that would carry him into sleep. Tomorrow would bring another day, ice to harvest perhaps, or if more snow came, paths to clear. Meals and prayers, work and rest, the endless gentle turning of the monastic wheel. He would meet it as he met every day, with patient attention and steady labor, trusting the rhythm, honoring the pattern. But those thoughts too released as sleep came closer. There was only the darkness now, and the warmth beneath the blankets, and the soft sounds of breathing all around. Oswald let himself sink into it, surrendering to sleep as he surrendered to each day's demands, with trust, with acceptance, with the deep peace that came from living in alignment with his purpose. Sleep gathered him in, and he descended into its depths. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Inside, the community rested, and in the ice house, frozen water waited patiently, holding winter's gift against the warmth that would eventually come, serving its purpose through simple being, through patient endurance, through the quiet faithfulness of fulfilling what it was made to do. The weeks that followed moved with winter's characteristic slowness, each day a small repetition of eternal patterns. Oswald continued his work with the ice house, maintaining the precious cold that would serve the community through the seasons ahead. The harvest was complete now, the house filled to its capacity with clear, solid ice layered carefully between straw, a reserve that spoke of preparation and care. As the days gradually lengthened, though still deeply cold, Oswald found his rhythms shifting slightly. With the ice house full, his morning journeys to the marsh became less frequent, transformed into occasional checks rather than daily harvests. This left more time for other tasks, tool maintenance, assisting other brothers with their work, longer periods in contemplation. One morning, after a night of particularly intense cold, Oswald stood at the entrance to the ice house and simply appreciated what had been accomplished. The structure sat solid and reliable, its thick walls holding winter secure in their embrace. Inside, stacks of ice rose in orderly rows, each piece cut and carried and stored with attention. The work of his hands, repeated over weeks, had created this reserve that would serve brothers he might never meet, in seasons he might not see. He descended the steps one more time, his candle casting familiar shadows on the stone walls. The cold air wrapped around him completely, and he stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the fruits of winter's labor. His weathered hands hung at his sides, and he breathed slowly, deeply, taking in this moment of completion. The ice would remain here, slowly diminishing as portions were carried up for use, cooling milk and butter in summer's heat, preserving fish on warm days, providing relief when the sun beat down on stone walls. Each piece would serve its purpose and disappear back into water, completing the cycle. Nothing permanent except the pattern itself. The gathering, the storing, the using, the returning. Year after year, the same and different, eternal and ever-changing. Oswald climbed back to the surface and secured the door with his usual care. The morning sun had broken through the clouds, sending shafts of pale light across the snow-covered grounds. Everything sparkled in the clean light, the white surfaces catching and reflecting the sun's rays, creating a landscape of almost painful brightness. The bell for terce rang, calling the community to prayer. Oswald made his way to the church, his footsteps certain on the cleared paths. Inside, the brothers gathered in their accustomed places, and the ancient words rose in familiar patterns. The Psalms spoke of creation and providence, of seasons and cycles, of the faithfulness that sustained all things. When the office concluded, Oswald found himself walking the cloister alone. He moved slowly, deliberately, his mind quiet and his heart at peace. The work was done, not finished forever, as winter would return and ice would need harvesting again, but complete for now, sufficient for the purpose. He thought about the months ahead. Spring would come eventually, bringing its own work and rhythms. The gardens would need planting, the fields would require attention, the monastery's life would shift into its warmer patterns. But that was the future's concern. For now, there was simply this moment, this morning, this clear, cold light, this sense of work accomplished and community served. Brother Godwin appeared in the cloister, walking toward him with that thoughtful pace that characterized the younger man. They fell into step together naturally, moving in synchronization around the covered walkway. "Is the ice house complete?" Godwin asked after they had walked in silence for a time. "Yes," Oswald confirmed. "Full and well stocked, it will serve through the coming seasons." "And when spring arrives," Godwin said, "my gardens will begin their cycle. The seeds we saved from last year's harvest, planted into earth warmed by lengthening days. Your ice is cooling what I grow in the heat of summer." "The pattern continues," Oswald observed. "Each season with its work, each task supporting the others." They walked on in comfortable silence, two men who had found their places within the monastery's life, each contributing their particular gifts, each sustained by the community's shared rhythms. The morning sun climbed higher, the shadows shifted, and the day progressed toward its midpoint. At Sext, the community gathered once more. The midday office passed quickly, and then came the main meal. Brother Aldric had prepared something special, a rich pottage with the last of the winter's dried mushrooms, fresh bread with honey, and even a small portion of preserved pear for each brother. The meal celebrated winter's provisions and honored the work that had made them possible. After dinner, Oswald returned to the ice house one final time, not to work, but simply to stand in its presence to acknowledge what had been accomplished. The door opened smoothly under his hand, well-maintained hinges, solid construction, everything as it should be. He stood at the entrance, looking down into the cold darkness where ice waited patiently. This work that he did, it was not grand or dramatic. No one would write chronicles about a lay brother who harvested ice. There would be no monuments, no lasting fame. But the work was good and necessary, serving real needs in immediate ways. The ice would cool the milk, preserve the butter, keep food fresh when heat would otherwise spoil it. Simple, practical, essential. And perhaps that was enough, perhaps more than enough. To have a place, to fulfill a purpose, to serve the community faithfully. These were gifts, not burdens. To know that your labor mattered, that your hands contributed something useful to the larger whole. This was a kind of wealth that required no acknowledgement beyond the work itself. Oswald closed the door and walked slowly back toward the main buildings. The afternoon sun had warmed the air slightly, and water dripped from the edges of roofs where snow was melting. Spring was still weeks away, perhaps months, but these small signs suggested its eventual arrival. The wheel would turn, as it always did, and new seasons would bring new work. But that was the future. For now, there was simply this afternoon, these stone buildings, this community of brothers, this life of prayer and labor. Oswald felt a deep contentment settle over him. Not excitement or joy exactly, but something quieter and more enduring. A sense of rightness, of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He made his way to the church and entered its familiar dimness. The space was empty of other people, and he walked to his small chapel and lowered himself carefully onto the stone floor. He sat with his back against the wall, his weathered hands resting in his lap, and simply breathed. The silence was profound and welcoming. Outside, the monastery continued its daily life, brothers at their various tasks, the rhythms of work and prayer proceeding as they always did. But here, in this small chapel, there was only stillness and breath and the deep peace of rest. Oswald sat without marking time, without agenda or goal. He was simply present, simply alive, simply grateful. For this place, for these brothers, for the work that gave his days structure and meaning. For the ice waiting patiently in its house, for the seasons that would turn, for the endless mercy that sustained all things. The light filtering through the narrow window shifted gradually as afternoon moved toward evening. The stone was cold against his back, but he had long ago made peace with such discomforts. They were part of life's texture, neither good nor bad, simply what was. Eventually he rose, his knees protesting as always, and made his way out of the church. The day was moving toward Vespers, toward the evening meal, toward Compline and sleep. The pattern would continue as it had for generations before him, as it would for generations after. He joined his brothers for Vespers, adding his voice to the ancient psalms. He took his place at the evening meal, grateful for simple food shared in the community. He walked the cloister as darkness gathered, his footsteps certain on familiar stones. And when the bell rang for Compline, he gathered with the others for the day's final prayers. The words spoke of rest and protection, of trust through the darkness, of the promise that morning would return. Oswald spoke them with his brothers, his voice one among many, part of a chorus that reached back through centuries and would continue into the uncounted future. When the service ended and the great silence began, he walked through the cold night to the dormitory. His bed waited, familiar and welcoming. He prepared for sleep with the same careful attention he brought to all tasks, then settled beneath the wool blankets. Around him, his brothers were doing the same, preparing for rest, releasing the day's concerns, trusting the night to hold them safely. The sounds were soft and comforting, the rustle of cloth, the creak of rope beds, the gentle sighs of bodies settling into rest. Oswald lay in the darkness, feeling sleep approaching. His body was tired but content, ready for restoration. His mind was quiet, the day's work complete, nothing left undone that could not wait for tomorrow. His weathered hands rested on his chest, and his breathing slowed into sleep's natural rhythm. Outside, stars blazed in the clear, cold sky. In the ice house, frozen water waited patiently, holding winter's gift. In the dormitory, the community rested, safe within stone walls, held by the pattern of their shared life. And Oswald, 41 years old, his hands marked by decades of honest labor, descended into sleep with a heart at peace. The night received him gently, and he let himself be carried into its depths. There was no resistance, no grasping, no fear, only the quiet surrender to sleep's embrace, the trust that morning would come, the deep peace of a life lived in faithful service to something larger than himself. And in that surrender, in that trust, in that peace, there was everything needed: rest and renewal, safety and shelter, the eternal pattern continuing its gentle turning, holding all things in its patient, enduring rhythm.